allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please call the roll.
Councilmember Francisco, Hart, Hotchkiss, Murillo,
Here.
Rouse, White, Mayor Snyder.
Here. And is there any public comment other than the budget? No. Okay. So just to put out there, I talked to Mr. Casey about the best organized way of trying to do this. We have kind of two major departments that we need to make some policy decisions on. One has to do with the airport, and then a whole bunch of stuff related to the general fund. So we thought what we would do is have the airport conversation first, and if you have public comment on that, and get that out of the way, and then we can have a substantive conversation about the general fund, have the presentation, go to public comment about the general fund, and that includes any requests from outside agencies. That would be the place to do it, and then we'll have the final deliberations, we hope final deliberations, here today. So with that, I turn it over to Mr. Samario.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council. Bob Samario, Finance Director and Acting Assistant City Administrator, and you took the words right out of my mouth. That's the exact format. And so just kind of a quick background, we've had a number of meetings with council going over the budget, the departmental budget. We've had a number of meetings with Finance Committee, and they've gone over parts of the budget. So we are now at the point where we're looking for council direction on primarily the airport item, and as well as the general fund, how we sort of balance the budget overall and our proposed strategy for that. So we'll start with the ARF, and then specifically what we'll do in the general fund when we get there, we'll first present to you the Finance Committee's recommendations. We'll also go over the requests from outside organizations, funding requests. We'll quickly review the service enhancements that we provided you in the past, and then we'll go over some options for how we might close the gap in reserves. There's been a lot of conversation around that, so we're going to provide you some options for that. And then at that point, we'll be looking for council direction on how we move forward with budget adoption scheduled for June 23rd of this month. So I first want to apologize. Hazel Johns, the airport director, would normally be making this presentation, but she's in Seattle as we speak, meeting with airlines, trying to drum up more business. That's, of course, important for us.
Really okay.
That's really okay. So I will not do as good of a job as she, but I hopefully just present. A lot of this is a review, so we'll cover it again. So what I see is sort of understanding or defining the scope of the problem. First, just to kind of give you some context. In April 2004, we had a substantial financial impact with the loss of American Eagle. The airport was able to, through a number of cost-cutting measures and other revenue measures, we were able to close that gap, but that was a pretty big hit. And then more recently, in January of 2015, about 5 months ago, Frontier Airlines left the airport, and that impact just this year alone is $350,000. But overall, we have seen a significant decrease in the number of flights since 2005. It's gone from 45 flights a day to 21, so more than a 50% decrease in flights. You've seen this chart before. It's really just counting how many passengers come in and out of the airport. And since 2006 or 5, we've had over a 20% decline in the number of passengers. And these are commercial passengers. And then this chart shows the number of flights, including general aviation, so how many aircraft are landing and taking off, not passengers, but aircraft themselves. And you can see the far right, we are down to about 105,000 from a high of 175 back in 1997. And again, about 3/4 of this is general aviation, but because we do generate revenues from general aviation, fuel flowage fees and rents and all that, it still has an impact on revenues. So just one slide just to give you some kind of understanding of how the airport is funded. The airport is divided into two major areas, and a lot of it is geographically divided. But on the south side of Hollister, we have the aviation properties, and then we have also the non-aviation commercial and industrial, which is the north side of Hollister. So those are the two categories of properties. If we look at the aviation property on the south side, it includes commercial aviation facilities, primarily the terminal. But we also have non-commercial aviation properties, where we have our fixed base operators, for example. So I'm going to be focusing on the aviation side south of Hollister, how those costs are recovered. Essentially, it charges to airlines. They're the main tenants of the terminal, and we charge them for being there, for occupying that space, and we charge them through landing fees. We also charge them a rent for the use of the terminal space, and we also charge, of course, concessionaires for that use of space. There are bridge boarding fees we charge, and then we also charge airlines for employee parking. So those are the primary sources of revenues for how we recover the costs related to the terminal and the airfield. So what's causing the deficits? Real simple. That we've had, the fact is that the decline in passengers has a direct impact on revenues at the airport. A lot of the revenues are tied to the number of passengers that are going through there, whether it's be parking, concessions, and those kinds of things. We've also had a decline in the number of airlines. So even though we've seen a reduction in passengers, what's really impacting us is the fact that airlines are leaving and have left, and that has a direct impact on the rents and landing fees that we charge. And as those terminal revenues then go down, then the airlines have been asked to pay more because, we have for the most part, you have fixed costs. And as the number of airlines go down, then we're having to ask those remaining airlines to pay more. And we've done a lot of that, but there's a limit to that because they looked at what other markets and other airports would charge, and we have to be sensitive to that. We see that in a lot of things we provide citywide. How much you charge, you don't want to be beyond the market because then you start losing sort of customers, if you will. So it's important to note that the costs today to maintain all of the aviation facilities are not being fully recovered. And the fact is they never really were. We've always been subsidizing the cost of the terminal through other revenue sources, which we'll talk about. Primarily, it's been this industrial commercial area revenues. Even when we had the old terminal, which the costs were a lot less, we were still subsidizing those rents and landing fees by about 25% through other revenues. With the new terminal coming online, the intent was to establish fees and charges that would fully recover those costs. That was the intent. So this is their multi-year forecast. I wanted to point out just a few things. First, here is the commercial industrial revenue. So North Hollister, these are the leases that they generate revenue-wise. You could see it's over $4 million. It gets up to over $5 million by 2020. These are the revenues that effectively have always subsidized the cost of the terminal. You could see $4 million, and I'll tell you that we're not spending $4 million on the north side of Hollister, all that property. We're not spending that much money to maintain it, and we even make improvements. We're spending a fraction of that, maybe 25%. So the balance is having to be used then to subsidize the terminal. It just so happens that subsidy now is not enough anymore because of the reduction in airline service. This is their capital program. You can see that this next year is $1.5 million, and we'll look at some of the details, but it ranges from a low of 752 in 17 to a high of 1.6 in 2020. This is really the scope, really the problem. If you were to take out capital out of the equation, they would be balanced. They have a sufficient operating revenues to cover their operating costs, but the capital component is what's causing the problems and will require them, therefore, to use reserves to fund that. And they've looked a lot at their capital program. What can we do? What can we not do? What can we defer? And they've been doing that already. The airport has been having a problem for the last 5 years and been responding to that through deferring capital programs and maintenance. So this, in their opinion, is an honest reflection of what they really need to pay for capital. And some of that comes from just having to match federal grants that are much larger than that. So it's important not to cut that back. So you can see that the bottom line is the net gain or loss. This would be the required use of reserves over the next 5 or 6 years in order to maintain operations as well as fund their capital program. And I also wanted to point out this is ARF. This is the Aircraft Rescue and Firefighting Services. You can see it's $2.1 million next year, but it goes up to 2.5 just because salaries and benefits go up each year incrementally. But it's a big cost to the airport. So you've seen this, but I just wanted to repeat the fact that if we go on this current trajectory, you'll see that the gap between our policy reserves and our actual reserves will be widening. In 2018, the actual reserves will start dipping into their disaster reserves. So, we've always held those reserves as being sort of important and sacrosanct because they are there primarily to respond to natural disasters and other emergencies. So by 2018, actual reserves will go down. Policy reserves, of course, go up because they're a function of the operating budget. So over the next 5 or 6 years through 2021, under this plan, we would be using $3.3 million of reserves, again, primarily for capital. And if we wanted to address that and say we want to somehow balance, it would require about $550,000 per year on average in order to avoid that. So that's kind of the magnitude of the structural problem, a little over $500,000 per year. So some alternatives to addressing the projected deficits. This is staff's recommendation. Option one is to reduce our services temporarily, and going from 3 to 2, it really amounts to 9 staff covering 24/7 down to 6. We would propose implementing this at mid-year, so it'd be at somewhere around January. So next year it would save the airport about $290,000, but on an ongoing basis it'd be about $600,000. We would propose, or the airport would propose, to reinstate that third position based on increases in air service. If Hazel is successful in bringing other airlines in and that helps the revenue picture, that would certainly be an opportunity, but it's really other opportunities such as development on the north side and increasing rents in those areas. But once that happens, then we're thinking it's a 5-year problem, and then after 5 years we would be back in the black. Option two is to reduce capital program by about $150,000 a year. We think that's it's a small number, but because the capital we're doing is minimal already and important. It would also require elimination or freezing of 5 to 6 airport positions, would generate about $350,000. That's 10% of the airport staffing. And then look for other opportunities to increase revenue from land rentals on a long-term basis. So in terms of the capital program, and if you have questions, by the way, we have airport staff here who can answer specific, more detailed questions than I can answer. But this, as you can see, is a long-term forecast of their capital needs. The very first row, the one I want to point out, is the amount we use to match large dollars that we get from the federal government, both discretionary and entitlement FAA funds. There's a 10-to-1 ratio, so for every $1 million we get, we contribute about $100,000 toward a project. So it's a really good way for us to leverage our dollars to make significant improvements to the airport and the airfield. You can see where I've highlighted, this is where they would like to take, they propose to take the money. We had to reduce capital, would be in the streets maintenance and in some of the paving at the OA. Smaller dollars. Down below, toward the end of the chart, you see in 19 and 20, you see some expenses related to some improvements to buildings and the like that are just to either help increase revenues or just to maintain buildings that are in pretty poor shape. So the airport, as I said, this is not a new problem. We've been having the problem since about 2007 or 8. They have already taken some actions to adjust for losses of revenues and reductions in air service. They reorganized the patrol and operations area. They have reduced staffing and planning. They deleted an associate planner. They've also reduced staffing in marketing. It was a marketing assistant, and then reduced parking operations. They closed Lot 2, as you know, and reduced staffing accordingly. And they've also canceled some shuttles, the shuttle vehicle lease. They do have some vacancies that would potentially be an opportunity to save money if we didn't fill them. Staff isn't recommending that, but if we had to, we would be looking at the airport business development manager. That was the position that Hazel Johns, the airport director, previously filled. In our opinion, it's an important position because it's the business manager effectively position that we have at almost every other department, and they are handling all the finances and the budgets, but they're also in charge of the capital project management. So it could have, including the north side development projects. This person would handle the transition of Ampersand to the building to the airport, which provides some opportunities there. And as I said, they are the key finance budget management position in that department. We also have 2 airport patrol officers that are positions that are just became vacant just in the last few weeks. The 2 combined would save about $180,000, except that, and you'll see down below, that we are having to backfill that with overtime because we have minimum hours that we have to cover. We can't reduce hours under FAA mandates, so we have to provide that through overtime. It's costing us, we expect this to cost us about $100,000, so we would net about $80,000 in savings. And as you can see at the bottom, airport does not believe it's a sustainable sort of model to have staff backfill that with overtime on a long-term basis. There's also an administrative assistant position that's vacant that would save $102,000. This is the position that really is responsible for collecting all the monies from the various properties that they lease out, so bringing in, doing the billing and the collection of those revenues, and also taking care of FAA grant reimbursements, TSA reimbursements, and again, really responsible for collecting all revenues that the airport receives. Some opportunities for increased revenues. We've seen this, but I want to just go over quickly. The Ampersand hangar lease, we believe, provides one of the key opportunities to generate increased revenues at the airport. It's a 50-year lease that expires in 2018. and the facilities and the existing tenants will revert back to the airport. At that time, beginning effectively fiscal year 2019, we will see an increase in revenues of $1.5 million with no change other than transition of those tenants to the airport. We factored that in already into our forecast of what we're projecting in terms of use of reserves and all that. We've already built in the $1.5 million coming in starting in 2019. But that building does have a pretty high vacancy rate of 34%. There are two parts to that. One is the office building, and that is, you can't see it, but it's behind and adjacent to this bigger hangar. And then the other part is the hangar mezzanine. If you look at the center of that building, you'll see this is some office space right in the center. It's just very small relative to the overall hangar. But those are two opportunities for us to generate additional revenue because they are vacant. So first, with the office building, it's about 30,000 square feet. Again, it's adjacent to the Ampersand hangar building. It's where Deckers used to be. They were renting that space for about $500,000 a year. But it's been vacant for the last couple of years. So again, it will revert to the city. But in order for us to rent that out, to lease it out, it would require substantial improvements to the facilities to make sure that the electrical's in order, HVAC, lighting, and all that. We expect conservatively it will need about $1 million to be in improvements in order to make it rentable. In addition to that, however, we would have to either fund ourselves tenant improvements or give an allowance to any tenant that would want to move in and make the necessary improvements to the space. Depending on what they do, it could be anywhere from $300,000 to $1.1 million that we would have to spend or we would have to give back as a tenant as a cost allowance. So either scenario, we're not looking for any meaningful return on that until about 2020. But once that comes online, once we make those improvements and either help fund them or have the tenants do that, we could see an annual revenue of about $630,000 to the airport. A lot of money, pretty substantial. That in it by itself would solve our problem. But we're not looking for that until 2020 at the earliest. The hangar building, 38,000 square feet. It's been vacant for many years. Deckers did lease a portion of that through 2013, and we're providing us $306,000 in rent. Under the master plan, we would be putting the city offices, airport offices in there. And there is an aviation use restriction, which means we can't just put any kind of business there. It has to be aviation related. So that presents the challenge in terms of filling that area. We don't believe it needs a lot of work, so the cost to get it ready to go would be negligible. But again, if any tenant wanted to really move in and make use of that space, it would require some kind of improvements in the same kind of order of magnitude, 380 to about 1.5. And we either do it ourselves, which would further consume reserves, or we give them an allowance. Same situation, best case scenario, we're looking at the lease coming in on a net basis in 2020, but generating $750,000 per year, substantial money, but not in the time we would need that. There are other opportunities to develop properties on the north side of Hollister, but again, whatever we do on the north side is going to require some amount of investment in order to make that happen, and that would mean use of reserves essentially. As you know, we have the pending sale to Direct Relief. That will provide one-time money and infusion for us to do some development, and it will pay for phase one of a three-phase project that'll start generating about $600,000 per year, starting in 2019 or 2020. The airport has felt that it's appropriate to take half of that to offset the loss of rents that we would get once we sell that property. And the other half would go to future development. Of course, it would build up over many years, but it would allow us to pay for a new development on the north side. But all this has been factored into our forecast. So this is not new necessarily, but it does provide that opportunity. So this is a summary of the issue. The reduction in air service over the last several years has had an impact on the airport's finances. The Ampersand lease will provide us some potential long-term to get back into the black, but it's not until 2020 or 21 at the earliest. But again, it does, and it would require significant capital investment, and it would have to come from reserves. We definitely think that we're going to be in pretty strong financial shape by 2021. So it's again, we define this as a 5-year problem, and so to make that happen, we'd either be looking at our services or other cuts. And if we're looking at staff cuts, we believe that would have a significant impact on the ability of the airport to run its operations, and certainly to move forward with any development projects that would generate more revenue. So staff's recommendation is to reduce our services. It was supported by the Finance Committee 2-1. It would preserve the reserves that we would need in order to fund our capital program, but also to provide opportunity money for additional revenue, generating more revenue through more developments or improvements to existing facilities. The annual cost of the ARP is about $2.1 million, but it grows every year, as you know. And we believe, as a staff level, that the reduced level of service is still reasonable, but in the context of the cost. It always comes down to cost and what you pay for safety, whether it's how many police officers you have or firefighters you have. You always have to consider cost, and we believe that this, in light of all the other options and the financial situation we're in, that a reduction in services would be appropriate. So at this point, I will turn it over to this council for direction, any questions that you might have.
Great. We'll start with questions. I want to start with one in terms of the revenue side. Unless I missed it, I didn't see what the projected new revenue would be at the restaurant where the E-Bar was, and didn't see any kind of. I mean, I imagine we're putting a lot of one-time money into it. I would think that's going to become a very good revenue source, either lease-wise or otherwise, and.
So, Madam Mayor, the expected revenue to be generated is about $12,000, $13,000 per month, but that has already been factored into these forecasts.
That's in the forecast.
Yes.
Okay. And can you remind me any sales tax that's generated through the restaurant portion that goes into the general fund or back into
Yes,
goes
general
into the
fund.
general fund? So really, that $12,000 to $13,000 a month is the lease arrangement.
Right.
Okay. All right. Ms. Murillo.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm a little surprised to see us back at this point in the conversation talking again about reducing fire services. It seemed like when we talked about it the last time, we didn't want to give up on public safety. And so do you see what I'm saying? I thought we were going to come back to the conversation about how do we do it? How can we make up for that any other way except reducing a firefighter out there in the case of an emergency. So, but let me ask about the Direct Relief International project. Is that going to bring us some revenue?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Murillo, so just the first part of that, Council did direct staff to work with the Finance Committee and get a recommendation from them. So we're essentially bringing back a recommendation from the committee and what we presented to them. The second part of your question is, yes, the Direct Relief for National Relief sale of property will provide us additional revenue in the long term. So we will lose about $300,000 a year in revenue from the property we sell to them, but the proceeds from that sale will provide us the money to do some investing on the north side and development on the north side. And then that will generate about $600,000 per year on an ongoing basis. But that won't be until 2019, I believe, we'll see, or maybe 20 before we see that revenue come in.
Okay, but that will be bringing in revenue
Yes.
once it's going. That's all for now. Thank you.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, I want to caution a little bit, though. We're going to be in a pickle if we have to reduce 10% of staffing out at the airport, which might include the assistant airport director position that we formerly had, who would have been responsible for developing the north side property. So we're going to get into a pickle if we go this way of go develop revenue, go develop the property, but reduce staff at the same time so you don't have the resources to do that. So I want to caution a little bit. We'll have to figure out. That's our job, and we'll manage that the best we can. But it'll be a tricky ask.
Okay. Any other questions? I have two public comment speakers on this. No? Okay. Carl Hopkins and then Karen Kahn. Welcome.
Good afternoon. My name's Carl Hopkins. I'm the current chair of the Airport Commission, and I'm here today to speak in favor of the proposal here, which reduces the ARF staffing from 3 firefighters to 2 with the resultant savings of approximately $500,000. For an airport with our traffic, the FAA mandates 1 firefighter and 1 truck. We currently have 2 trucks and 3 firefighters. So if we proceed with this reduction, we will still be double the FAA recommendation. We are the only Index B, that's the sizing that the FAA uses, the only Index B airport in California that staffs with 3 firefighters. Everybody else staffs with 2 or some even with 1. As you've just seen, there is a budgetary problem. The reductions are caused by airline consolidation. There used to be lots and lots of airlines out there, and now there are significantly fewer. They've resulted in, because of their change in the way they've chosen to do business, a lot of airlines have reduced flights into smaller airports, and the reduced flights means reduced revenue. As you've also seen, the airport has worked very hard over a number of years to reduce the costs and to improve revenue, and we believe that, or I believe, and obviously the airport and a number of others, that this is really the only viable option left. Any of the alternatives create a variety of problems. The capital budget, as was mentioned, a significant portion of that is a 90-10. Every dollar we save, we lose 90. And to make matters even worse, that money, although it comes from the FAA, it comes from our residents, the residents of this city, the people who use that airport. They paid the taxes, they paid the fees, and if we can't provide the match, then that money will go someplace else to some other airport.
You need to wind up, please.
I'm sorry?
You need to wind up, please.
Oh, okay. I would also point out that the expected reduction at the airport for the RF unit is 3 positions by attrition, whereas the airport is likely to be 5 to 6 people by being laid off. We don't have the option of reducing the patrol because if we reduce that patrol or we suddenly get somebody leaving, we may very well have TSA basically shut us down.
Thank you. Ms. Khan?
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, members of the council. My name's Karen Khan. I've been an airline pilot for 36 years, 28 of those years as a captain on the MD-80, Boeing 757 and 67. I've served on the Santa Barbara Airport Commission for over 16 years, since 1987, and I've also been the Airline Pilots Association's airport safety liaison representative for both Santa Barbara and Santa Maria, local pilot, aircraft owner, and a master certificated flight instructor. If Santa Barbara were newly built today, if the airport came into being here today in 2015, and we were just opening our doors for the first time with the same type of airplanes that serve us today, we would apply for an Index B certification, and that would allow for 1 fire truck and 1 or 2 firefighters. I support the double staffing of 2 fire trucks, I think it's a good idea, and 2 firefighters, which is double the FAA required staffing. For comparison purposes, the other type of safety personnel mandated by the FAA are the flight attendants on the aircraft, and they provide the immediate response for firefighting and passenger evacuations. Very frequently, the firefighters aren't there. The flight attendants are the first ones to deal with the problem. The FAA mandates a minimum number of flight attendants on board, just as they do the minimum number of firefighters and fire trucks at the airport. Airlines staff to the FAA minimums. As a current pilot, I'm constantly aware of the maintenance level at the airport. Airlines and pilots value the infrastructure maintenance very highly and see it as the key to daily airport safety. Airport maintenance is a top priority in our view and is valued much more highly than staffing the firefighting positions above the FAA mandated minimums. In closing, from the perspective of a major airline pilot and experienced airline industry professional, I've flown for 26 years as a captain and am very comfortable with the FAA safety minimums at a level of 2 firefighters. I urge you not to reduce the airfield maintenance level in favor of further overstaffing the firefighter complement. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment speaker slips on the airport? No. Okay, so it's back to the council. Can I start with Chief McElroy, actually? I have a question. And I know, Chief, we're putting you in a rock and the hard place kind of thing here, but that's why you get to be chief, right? So I'm hearing, and I watched part, I have to admit, I didn't watch the entire Finance Committee meeting, but I did watch the bulk of this section of it. And then reading the report and talking to, and I have talked with other staff in your department, I'm getting mixed information. So maybe you can help me out here. And one of the things I'm hearing is we are the only airport of our size and similar type that has these kind of staffing. I guess part of and I guess part of the mixed information has to do with other airports that may be similar but have other access with other ARF trained personnel that maybe different departments or something like that. I wonder if you could just first clarify what is the actual statistics we are trying to compare with, so we can compare our airport with others like us.
Madam Mayor, Council, I saw the presentation as well, and they're absolutely correct that the minimum FAA required staffing is one firefighter for a level B, or one or two. In terms of the other level B airports, there's a context that I think needs to be looked at, and so I grabbed some of the airports from the slide that was shown last week. So, for example, Fresno Yosemite does indeed have two ARF personnel. Fresno also has a truck company directly across the runway, which is a 3-person staff, and there's an Air National Guard ARF station on that airport as well. Monterey Regional has indeed one ARF person, but there's a 3-person engine that's co-located with the ARF where they're cross-trained, and Monterey just merged with CAL FIRE, and so a CAL FIRE station that was across on the other side of the airport is now also available for response on the airport. So that's 2 engines plus the 1 ARF, so that's 7 people. San Luis Obispo, 1 ARF as well, but Engine 21 is there as well with a 3-person crew, and there's also a rescue and a 3,000-gallon water tender, and that's paid call staffing. Bakersfield, Meadows Field has 2 ARF 24/7, funded by the Kern County Fire Department, and backup is provided by 3 adjacent Kern County fire stations. Stockton has 2 firefighters 24/7, and it has also engines around the area. The difference between, this is part of the context, the difference for us as a fire department is we are kind of an island in terms of where we're located. We have county engines coming in and responding as well, but we don't have them on the airport proper. It was stated last week that when the county ran the station, there was 3 to 4 people, and when we had a response, when the engine had a response in district, they would leave 1 person to meet the FAA minimum. But the county was actually staffed with 6 people. It had 3 people on the ARF response and 3 people on the engine response. And when the county left and built their station across the freeway by Maravilla, that engine that was adjacent to the ARF station, our current ARF station, now instead of being proximal to our response, is now on the other side of the freeway. So it's a value argument, and I understand that this is a rock and a hard place. If directed to reduce to 2, we'll do the best that we can. But you need to know that it is a reduction in the service that we've provided there for 25 years.
Right.
And
No,
it's,
of course.
so the question kind of comes, if we overstaffed for 25 years and now we need to go down.
And are county staff all ARF trained? I sound like a dog. ARF trained? Are they? It's just an odd word. So, in terms if you needed an extra engine coming in, would it be our own staff from I guess Fire Station 4, or would it be county fire coming in? Because it's a specific thing on a runway, right? You need specific training in order to combat that kind of incident.
Madam Mayor, members of council, currently what we will get engine 17, which is out at UCSB, engine 14, which is over, like I said, by Maravilla. These are county engines, and county engine 11 and truck 12 or truck 11 from Stork Road. The county is not ARF trained. It doesn't have they don't put the training hours into keeping their people ARF certified. The people that we would be having coming from the city would respond from, as well as downtown. The closest ones would be from Ontario Road and Modoc and Las Positas, our stations 4 and 5. And we keep cross-trained ARF personnel there. So that would be our response. But so when the county does respond out there, they will not be taking out another ARF vehicle. They will be responding with an engine.
And the ability, let's say there's a fire on an aircraft on the runway, what would be the capability of a non-ARF trained engine? What would they be able to do?
They would be bringing between 400 or 500 gallons of water, and they would attempt, if they needed to attempt an interior attack, that's what they would do.
Okay, that helps. Ms. Murillo.
Thank you. So, Chief, there's a difference between the FAA and the NFPA, right? The National Fire Protection Association, which isn't that an association that looks at safety? And what I remember from the last hearing is that the FAA requires this really small amount of people at Los Angeles International Airport. So saying that the FAA requires something, we really need to question that. Isn't that true?
Well, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Murillo, it's like I said at the last meeting, fire department staffing is a local value. Why we have the NFPA as one advisory board that we look at. OSHA is another one that gives us more firm mandates, but you adopt a portion of what the NFPA recommends. So we're staffed less than what the NFP recommends, but that's kind of a value it's shared by the rest of our department. We have staffed 3-person engines. That's our standard working complement. So the FAA would require a larger number, which we haven't as a city chosen to staff at the airport. But so their guidelines, the FAA is a firm minimum guideline, but the NFPA is an advisory thing that a city chooses to adopt or not to adopt. We staff at the 3. We don't fully accept all the NFPA recommendations, but it is an advisory thing. It's not a statutory deal. It's something where you do what the city values and what the city can afford, and that's how our staffing is done.
Okay. And one of the public speakers said that airline attendants are trained in emergencies. I'm sure that's true. They're certainly not firefighters. Is that correct?
That's correct, but they do, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Maria, they do an outstanding job of evacuating aircraft. When you look at the Asiana crash in San Francisco, they do a remarkable job. And the FAA regulations are based on providing support to existing exit ways. So we need to get a truck out there flowing product within 3 minutes to protect the exit ways so that the crew can evacuate passengers and themselves. That's what the standard is based on.
But in the context of this conversation, an airline attendant is not a firefighter. Isn't that true?
Yes.
Okay.
And in terms of Los Angeles, there's a couple things at play there. They staff higher than the FAA minimum, but the number that they have is so high because of the sheer scale of the airport. To be able to reach that 3-minute response time on a piece of land the size of LA International Airport requires that you have multiple stations located through the airport. So it's true that they do staff each ARF rig at a 3 or 4 person level, but the number, which is in the 20s, is because the scale of the airport requires them to do that.
Okay.
To meet that 3-minute standard.
Okay. And I have Ms. Applegate. Would you give this to the chief, please? This is a page that I copied out of the consultant's report. Can you explain finding number 9 for us, please? And we paid $50,000 for this report, and
Maybe explain what it is that you're talking about so we all.
There were, I believe, 10 findings that were produced by Citygate, which was the consultant we used to study our airport services. Finding 9 is, given the risks present in the premier status of Santa Barbara, it is not at all unreasonable or out of the national norm, as also evidenced by the survey conducted in this study, to staff the ARF station with 3 personnel per day if the city can afford to do so. The choice to fund more than 1 firefighter per day at minimum is a city choice regarding the use of their funds.
okay, so it wouldn't be out of the national norm for us to keep it at 3.
That's the finding of this consultant, yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Francisco?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I was one of the two who voted that eliminating one ARF staff position per shift was the best way, given the airport's financial difficulties, to solve this problem. And I have been wrestling back and forth with this. We've got a very, very difficult choice here. And given the incredible decline in air service at the airport, it really puts us in a bind. And I don't know, Mr. Samario, if we hadn't built the new terminal, would we be facing this financial difficulty?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Francisco, that's a good question. I guess you could say, that's one cause, but it's just a reduction in airline service. I mean, if we had even seen close to what we had projected and not to change what we've seen in the industry as a whole, I think we'd be fine. So did we build it too big? I don't know. We built it to accommodate what we needed at the time, and with some moderate projections of increases, but I think it's really the decline in air service and passengers that have caused the problem.
Yeah.
Unexpected.
It's a very tough situation, and we may have been. I mean, I remember when we were discussing going forward with the new terminal, one of the things that we heard repeatedly was every time we've built a new airport, we've also had an incredible increase in the number of flights, and that gave us some confidence in moving forward with it. But we seem to have gone into this at exactly the wrong time in terms of, and we couldn't have predicted that, in terms of air traffic. So one of the most persuasive things for me when I was looking at this was that chart that we looked at the Finance Committee, and the chart of all of the Index B airports in California. And if looking at that chart, you would think that we have the highest staff of firefighters of any of those airports. But as Chief McElroy just outlined, this may be accurate as far as the actual ARF-trained staff of the airport is concerned, but it's not accurate in terms of what kind of support staff is surrounding those people. We have airports on here that have 2 or 3 fire stations directly adjoining the airport. We have one that has 4 ARF-trained National Guard airmen available on the airport. So, in fact, it seems to me, knowing what I know now about these numbers, we actually have one of the smallest safety staffs of any of these Index B airports. So I have gone back and forth on this. This is an extremely confusing and complex topic. And I wish that we could find a way to preserve the airport's ability to do more capital projects and do more of the things that we hope will bring us more money in future years. But given the numbers I see here, I don't see how we can reduce the fire staff. If we really had the largest fire staff of any of these airports, I'd say, hey, something's out of balance here. If, in fact, we have the smallest. And it's not just that. It's that our fire staff has been trained to work on 3-man crews. I have to think that there's a lot of just institutional, operational efficiency. And it's not to say that if we said you're going to have to do this with a 2-man crew that they wouldn't figure out a way to do it. But they've put all of their training time into reacting with a 3-man crew. So I think that's another added risk that we're putting in here. So I wish we didn't have to do this. I wish there were another way, but it seems to me now, given these facts, that it would be unwise to reduce the ARF staffing.
Mr. White?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I was the other vote in support of reducing staffing on this station, and also have been wrestling with it all weekend and talking with the various members of staff. And as I thought about it further, one of the things that I realized is that this is one of the consequences of Jack Ricard's bold move 70 years ago to gain, for the city of Santa Barbara to gain control of this property. And the city ended up with an island surrounded by unincorporated area. And now we are an island out there trying to perform full urban services, including staffing an airport with all manner of services. And we run into quirks all over the place. And we also run into out there, I do work with the city of Goleta, for example, and back in the unincorporated days in unincorporated areas, there's some resentment out there as well. That the city of Santa, there's leftovers from 70 years ago that this land grab occurred. And one of the consequences of that is we end up with this island of trying to provide top quality safety in the midst of an area where we don't have the infrastructure that the chief mentioned, that Mr. Francisco alluded to, of having co-located services where you have 2-for-1 specials going on around you. 35 years ago, I was working for the county fire department and helping to manage a very complicated system where the county had taken over a contract with the University of California, UCSB, with the Mission Canyon Fire District, as well as with the city of Santa Barbara. The county provided the services here. And, of course, what happens there is that they, as we do in our fire protection services, they bring in, it's a symphony of activities that goes on so that there's going to be levels of service maintained. And is it fair for us to then be completely dependent on the county for quick backup? I question that. And so that's one of the places where I land in a similar place. And also I'm so aware of the capital needs out there, the cash flow changes. And I think that we've all had this conversation over the last 6 months or however long. This is not something that I take lightly, and I'm not just trying to protect firefighter jobs. It's just, as Mr. Francisco is saying, it's just a tough problem. So, and the notion of, I can tell you, as the county's fire protection planner in those days, 3-person engine companies is where it's at. And they start from the minute they start being firefighters, they're working in 3s. And we were working in those days with the problem as a 2-person engine company at Mission Canyon. And people, the risk to the firefighters themselves is greater with 2 when there's not a 3rd person completing the team. So, and I think the other points have been brought up. So I'm just reluctantly heading in the direction. There is one last piece, and it sounds like at least wouldn't be happening in this fire season, which we're hearing now repeatedly that this could be shaping up to be one of the mothers of all fire seasons. The conditions are already October conditions right now, and it's just, we're in for a very tough summer, but it doesn't sound like this would be clicking in until hopefully El Nino comes in the winter, and we won't be talking about the terrible fire conditions. But we are losing, obviously in the long term, we would be losing that, and the rest of the city fire department runs thin. We've already cut back to a place where we're using lots of overtime, and so the margins of error are less. And so when we have a great big incident, which we know we have too often, then, as the term I've used repeatedly, our bench isn't as deep. And this is one place where the 3-person engine company performs an extra function, including mutual aid, which is even part of the financial benefit there of our fire department. So, as I say, this is a tough one, and I don't envy our staff for having to come up with solutions to how we unwind this, how we cover while one or two of these hoped for $500,000 a year revenue streams comes back, I think I would imagine it to be a nip and a tuck in several places is how this is going to occur. Mr. Casey made the point that you can't go forward with new ideas without having the staffing to do it. I think this is a place where the reserves, and again, this is an area where I'm up here for 5 years. And we'll be talking more about reserves later on. But that this is what the reserves are for. Even the emergency reserves, I just feel like this is a place where we can go. And we haven't talked about the benefits of the rest of the airport in terms of, we heard something about property taxes and sales taxes. What does the airport bring this city? I'm imagining it's a fair amount. And certainly in terms of employment and quality of life and all of that, it's definitely an asset. So obviously, as I said, the city got wrong-footed on the terminal. And I can tell you that at one point, 10 years ago, we were talking about a bigger terminal than we actually built. We were saying, let's build one that's even bigger. So we did something right where we didn't go for the whole tamale on that. And so that's the good news. But I do think we need to maintain, and I'm willing to come back and look at this next year. I appreciate that legally we can do this, but year by year, still think we need to keep an eye on it, and if things continue to stay really bad and we need to make some other moves, so be it. But so I'm certainly game to come back and look at it some more in a year and just make sure that we're not just holding on to something that's headed into a downward spiral. But I would be supporting maintaining the current levels of service there this year.
Mr. Hotchkiss and then Mr. Hart.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, you're going to use the good phrase, heading into a downward spiral. That's exactly what the staff is arguing about, that the airport is headed in a downward spiral. As the members of the commission said, they've all looked at this very carefully. I'm a little surprised, although I appreciate both you and Mr. Francisco's concern. The report that you read, Chief, that recommended a higher number, I don't know remember the letters that you used, but it said something about we recommend so-and-so. Then it said, if the city can afford to do so. You want to find that phrase there? I think it's in paragraph 9.
Mayor Schneider, Councilmember Hotchkiss. The two sentences, I believe, the national norm also has evidence by the survey conducted in this study to staff the ARP station with 3 personnel per day if the city can afford to do so.
That's what I was talking about.
The choice to fund more than one fighter per day per FAA minimum is a city choice regarding the use of funds.
Right, so that's a key phrase. If the city can afford to do so, we've just said that the city cannot. To Mr. Samario, if we proceeded on the basis of what some of my colleagues have suggested and left the ARF and lost these other positions, how would we feel that as a public at the airport?
Yeah, Councilmember Hotchkiss, we would have to kind of go back and regroup to see how we're going to handle that and which positions we would look to eliminate.
But some service losses, some efficiencies.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the critical one is the opportunity to look for or generate new revenues through improvements or new development. And that's where I think is going to probably suffer the most, because one of the positions that would presumably be left vacant or eliminated is the person in charge of development.
Thank you. Chief McElroy, to come back to you. We've had some minor incidents out at the airport over the last 10 years. Have we been able to meet those satisfactorily?
Mayor Schneider, Councilmember Hotchkiss, yes, I believe we've been out there for 25 years and we've handled everything that's come our way.
Okay, so we have a 25-year track record that argues well for what we've got. And now we've got a reduction of up to 40 to 60%. It depends if you do flights or passengers. And yet we want to keep the same staffing. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. As a business person, I know if my business retracts or contracts, I have to make a comparable decision insofar as my staff is concerned. That only makes sense to me. If we look for a sustainable solution, to use a popular phrase at the airport, we've got to be able to support it. And we can't here. We've got a hole in the bucket, and we're proposing not to fill it up, not to plug it up, but just pour more water in. That's not the way you deal with holes in the bucket. You plug it up, and in this case, it would mean the loss of one arm. Thank you.
Mr. Hart?
Well, actually, to Councilmember Hotchkiss' point specifically, I don't think we're talking about that. We're talking about which staff. And I think it's a question of public safety staff versus not public safety staff. And that basic level of protection the public expects. That's exactly what we're talking about here is we don't have enough money to do both, but we're not proposing to do both. We're proposing to say that public safety is the primary responsibility, and we have to figure out a way to be for that, and then we have to right-size the staff on the other side, which is really, frankly, the issue. As passenger levels have dropped off, airport staff hasn't dropped off to track that. I mean, we've got a 40% reduction in people using planes, but we don't have nearly that kind of reduction on the staffing side. So that is the hard choice that we have here, and I think that what I'm hearing from my colleagues, I know the Finance Committee spent a lot of time on this, and I really appreciate Councilmember White and Councilmember Francisco is really looking at this even more since we last had our discussion and coming to the conclusion that we do have to start with public safety. And we have to have that as the foundation to what we're trying to do with this budget and then adjust on the other side. And I don't think it's a given that we can't do the development on the commercial commercial and industrial properties. In addition to this, I think that would be penny wise and pound foolish. We need to get that revenue. That is the answer in the long run, is to get to that place where we have increased rents from those properties that are looking ahead. I think we should be looking at debt instruments to do those capital improvements on those revenue generators. You know, if we're looking at maybe spending $3 million in tenant improvements to get those buildings up to speed, and we're going to generate almost $1 million in rent from that. That's a great business proposition that's going to continue to pay dividends over time. So we need to have a strategy that looks at making that revenue stream realized as fast as possible. So that's what the staff needs to do, is to roll up its sleeves and figure out how to do that, as Mr. Casey said, and I'm sure they're going to be capable of doing that. But to me, the decision for us is just this fundamental public safety issue, is what should we do about that? And I support retaining the ARF at the current level.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, clearly no one up here is expert at running an airport or at public safety, but I'm always a little bit dismayed when public safety comes to the chopping block when we have economic issues. We lost some of our PD in the past years ago doing that. We've built it back. We talked about closing a fire station at one time, and I happen to know somebody personally who's alive today because that fire station was not closed. So I have a hard time going to public safety as the default for savings, even though public safety is really expensive. It's the most expensive thing we do. It's also the most important thing we do. In terms of the number of flights, and yeah, I agree with you, Mr. Hotchkiss. You're absolutely correct. I mean, proportionally, you have to look at cutting costs when your revenue goes down. There's no doubt about it. The issue that I have in a situation like this is that it only takes one incident. It doesn't take a series of incidents. It's not a matter of volume. It just takes one horrendous incident. You're going to be, am I the guy that said, let's cut the public safety down? I don't want to be that guy. I think there's a reason why we had it out there. The chief mentioned it was out there for 25 years, and I know that we've had rough revenue times in the past where we've had to look at this very, very carefully. And yet, even though we had some tough times, and even though there were penny pinching times, we kept that same staffing. So I don't think it's a luxury. I don't think public safety is a luxury. It's not an amenity. I think it's a necessity. And I think it's our priority. So I'm concerned about the airport. I complete respect and thankful for the airport commissioners that came here today. But public safety is not where I want to go when it comes to cutting back on our expenses.
Well, I think the money spent on the the report, having an outside agency come in and really look at this was very helpful. It needed that kind of outside objective looking in, and I think that was I know Mr. Armstrong was part of that decision making, and having been being a pilot with a plane there, that he probably had a vested, no, I shouldn't say that, he had an interest in that. And that was smart. And I understand the situation that we're in. I have to agree with what Mr. Rouse said. I don't want to wait and hope and have our fingers crossed that we don't have an accident in the next couple of years before revenues come up, and just see if a two-person station can take care of the same as a three when we've done three very well for all this time, especially when we don't have the complementary type of trained ARF personnel nearby from other agencies like we do in like has the report actually showed in similar airports. Also in other discussions I had, in terms of the reallocation of duties or funds or positions, I would also agree that the position that would focus on bringing in new revenue we need to have, because that's the point in moving forward. And I think we're looking at, we don't have to make this decision today like it's going to be like this forever. As Mr. White said, we can look back in another year, see how hopefully Hazel's having a fabulous time in Seattle, and they're, and we can bring some additional service. I know that we've been very aggressive in that. The two airport patrol officers that became vacant, I know that there are FAA minimum staffing requirements. I wonder if there's other kinds of patrol-related things on the airfield that our firefighters could do, that they may be able to do, alleviating some of the hours of work necessary by the patrol officers so they can then do what the FAA requires. I mean, those kind of things I think I would rather look at very carefully first before saying we're going to cut from 3 to 2 at the station. And we can review this in 6 months. We can review this again next year. So this isn't, and hopefully we'll have new numbers coming in and see how direct relief is going and see how the other leases are happening and hopefully additional air service, because that's really what this is all about. So I think it'd be too hasty to just out of this report that came out a few months ago just to say we're just going to cut the public safety aspect of it and just in order to balance the budget. I just don't like the messaging that has, and I don't think that's the best way to go right up from the top. I understand, I appreciate where people are coming from in terms of the budget, but that's I can't go there. So, Mr. Hotchkiss, your light's on. Did you have something else?
I do, Madam Mayor. Mr. Colon, how do we pass this and say come review in 6 months? Can we do that? Is that part of the motion?
I think that question is better directed to Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we do mid-year budget reports, and you could ask for a more thorough report on the status of the airport budget in 6 months, and we'll certainly do it next year as part of the mid-cycle look at the 2-year budget.
Well, then I would suggest that we move forward with this with the proviso that we look at it in 6 months. And if that's the case, I'd be willing to vote for it.
What's the this that you're talking about?
That we accept option 2.
Okay.
Is that keeping the service?
That's keeping the staffing at the airport
Keeping
the
the
same.
service?
Right.
Yeah.
So we go with option 2 with a review, with the mid-year budget review. Okay, so is that a motion and a second?
That is.
So motion Hotchkiss and second Rouse. Anything else to the motion on this? Okay, tough decision, yeah. So appreciate the conversation. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay, that's unanimous. Okay, so that takes care of the airport portion of the budget. Thank you. You're welcome to stay, of course, for the general fund part of it, and we'll move on to that part of the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Madam Mayor and council members. We're on to the general fund. We'll start with the Finance Committee's recommendations. As you know, they met on a number of occasions. We presented a number of topics to them. I didn't include the ones that we presented for informational purposes only. We covered pensions and the MLAP program. But the items that they reviewed that were subject to recommendation included what we'll be talking a lot about this afternoon, and that's the general fund budget strategy, including the funding of policy reserves. We looked at the general fund tax revenue assumptions like bed taxes and sales tax and property taxes. What are the growth assumptions? We looked at the general fund and enterprise fees that are proposed for next year. And we just talked about the ARF and the staff recommended adjustments. Attached to your report are some minor adjustments to the proposed budget that would be part of the adopted budget. The Finance Committee went through those carefully and recommended those. I'm not going to present those today. And then we have requests from outside organizations that we presented to the Finance Committee. So their actions, they unanimously approved the general fund tax revenue assumptions, so those growth assumptions for our key tax revenues. They also unanimously approved the proposed fees for general fund services as well as enterprise funds. And they also approved the staff recommended adjustments. Other recommendations were the 2-to-1 we just talked about for our. They really didn't provide funding recommendations specifically for the outside organizations or recommendations, but they did provide some tentative support for certain ones, and I'll go over those with you shortly. And then with regard to the balancing strategy, they unanimously approved and supported closing the gap in reserves in 18 months. And we'll look at that as well. So you will have in your agenda report all the letters that...
Madam Mayor?
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Mr. Samario. I just wanted to go back to the fees, and I'm sorry I didn't watch that part of the Finance Committee. Was there anything that stood out in raising fees, or it's the usual?
Yeah. Madam Mayor, Councilmember Murillo, nothing unusual. The ones that were more unusual, we had specific conversation about the water, of course, and the like. But other than that, it was the typical 3% per year that we tend to do, 2 to 3%.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So again, in your agenda report, we put all the letters that from organizations requesting funding. I'm not planning on going through all of them, but what I did want to point out when we went over them with the Finance Committee, that there were 4 where we had at least 2 votes. We had a unanimous approval for the Casa Esperanza going from continuing the funding this year to next year. Councilmember Francisco and Councilmember Hart suggested making that a one-time funding again in 16, and so essentially evaluated in every year. There was 2-to-1 support for the Community Environmental Council's request for $50,000 toward a feasibility study on community choice energy. And then there was a 2-to-1 support for the additional funding on the junior high school after-school sports program, adding $12,830. And then also there was a 2-to-1 support for a reduction in the rent that we charge the police activities league for running the teen center, going from $98.84 to $1. So it's a reduction of $98.83. But you can see overall we had $279,000 of requests above what we've already provided for in the budget of 3% for community promotions fundings at least. So again, we'll have this if you want to get back to this. If you have any questions?
Correct. I did not support the ongoing on the Casa Esperanza. I'm also a one-timer, so just
thank you.
Thank you. That for the record.
Thanks for that correction. And then service enhancements, I'll go through these quickly. So I broke them up into 2 categories: those that require additional funding, and then those that do not require additional funding. So these next 2 slides are those that do require more money. In the Administrative Services Department, there was a request for an Administrative Analyst 2. This is to help and assist Christy Schmidt, the Administrative Services Director, in labor negotiations. As you know, she was the Labor Relations Manager, was promoted to the Director, Department Head, and so this position would assist her in those labor relations functions because she still, of course, has to run the rest of the department. The net cost of that position would be about $92,400. The City Attorney's Office has requested a modest increase for one-time costs of $10,800, publications, memberships, and the like. The Community Development Department asked for, and we proposed a $7,000 one-time funding for assistance to do some outreach on the ZIR improvement process. And then in the Fire Department, it's restoring a position. It's the Public Education Coordinator position that was eliminated a number of years ago. That would cost $92,000. And at the library, this restoring a Library 2 position. This would be to handle the new children's library down at the basement, a net cost of $87,000.
Ms. Murray, did you have a question? Your light's on.
Well, I did. I had a question about the Chamber of Commerce request. Is that later?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. So Parks and Recreation, there were a number of positions, a couple of positions being requested for restoration. The first is restoring a project management position. This would be a senior planner. And this is really to help get projects completed. They have essentially Jill Zachary, who is primarily responsible for moving forward capital projects such as the Cabrillo Arts Pavilion project renovation. And so because of the funding the last few years and proposed funding in the next couple of years, we believe this is an important position to get these projects moving forward and completed. The net cost of that, since there's some money in other parts of the budget, as well as being able to charge this position to some of those projects, the net cost would be $79,500. We're also looking to restore a recreation specialist to expand the revenue-based classes at Carrillo Rec Center. You can see there's some small offsets of about 5,000, but the net cost would be 49,000. We actually believe that the revenue opportunities there or potential are greater to the point where they might fully fund that position. So this position will be focusing on those revenue-generating classes at the rec center. And then there is also a request from the downtown organization of a total of $18,500. Half of that would be funded from the downtown parking fund, as you know. It's split in the balance within the general fund in the Parks and Recreation Department. So it's really a request from the downtown organization for additional funding for maintaining State Street. And then in the police department, there was a request and a proposed position in the combined communications center, in the 911 dispatch center, for a civilian manager. That position would cost $165,000, and this was based on a recommendation from a study that it's more appropriate to have a civilian manager than a sworn manager. And the next item is really just a shift. We're moving a position from the streets fund to the general fund, and this is actually going backwards from what we did in the past when we were dealing with budget issues in the general fund. We actually have on a net basis, have transferred about 3 positions out of the general fund into the streets fund, even though it benefits all projects. So this proposal would move one of those positions back, and this would then free up a little bit of money to do more pavement work, essentially. And then you can see there in the community promotions, as I mentioned, we did build into the recommended budget a 3% increase to all community promotions organizations, with the exception of Visit Santa Barbara, and that totals $32,390. Then there are a few positions and services that we are recommending that do not require additional funding. They were funded from either additional revenues and or other appropriations that were able to be used. In the city attorney's office, they actually deleted a position, the part-time legal secretary, which was used then to fund some contractual services when caseloads get high in the city attorney's office, as they often can. And then sometimes they would come back to council for more new money. This would provide some appropriation authority to do some of that work. In the finance department, we have an accounting supervisor position that we're proposing at a cost of $119, fully funded from existing appropriations or revenues. And then in Parks and Recreation, restoring 2 positions, a head pool lifeguard. It's a 0.8 position. You can see that it's fully funded primarily from hourly support staff who are already doing the same work. And this is to provide more and expanded coverage at Los Banos pool in light of a new contract with the swim club that requires more and broader, more time of staffing in the early mornings and the later evenings. And then restoring an office specialist 2 position in recreation. This would help provide support to all programming. Okay, and so we can go back to the chamber if you wanted, Councilmember Murillo, if you want to just, go back to the list.
Madam Mayor? So in the light of the conversation we just had about fewer passengers, what would you say to the argument that we need to add funding to the visitor serving function?
You know, Councilmember Murillo and council members, I think it's not a bad idea. It's just, the airport can't afford to do it right now. Obviously, there was some funding provided by the airport, but the airport said we really can't afford to do so. So the chamber has come now asking for general fund support for that. We do still get visitors. It still provides a good function. So I think there's still value in that. It's just who pays for it.
Madam Mayor and Councilmember Rio, I think the policy question to look at is, do you want some sort of visitor information at your airport or not? We provide general fund support for the visitor center at Garden Street and other areas, so there's logic to the chamber wanting us to partner with them if they're going to provide a service out at the airport. I think the policy question for you all is, do you like having a table there at the airport and baggage claim to provide visitor information services?
Well, the letter had some broad numbers of people that ask questions, and but what does that break down to? Is it one person an hour or 2 people an hour? I just, maybe I need more information if we're going to start arm wrestling on some of the other items, and I don't see Mr. Opplinger here to make a case for it. But thank you for your answer.
Mr. Hart?
Well, this is really a regional benefit because it's promoting the whole region, essentially, and giving people information who are coming to any destination, not just the city of Santa Barbara. They're using the airport to come to the county. And I had mentioned at the Finance Committee the possibility of talking to the folks at Visit Santa Barbara about whether they'd be in a position to help this, since they're kind of they are the regional tourism and marketing efforts. So have you had a chance to do that? Okay.
But we can certainly do that.
Hey, go ahead.
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier at the very beginning, we've been talking a lot about the how we might want to close reserves, the gap in reserves. So what I wanted to start with, and this applies to whatever scenario we're going to be looking at, and we'll be looking at options for closing the gap in 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years. And if it was really the direction of council to do it in 18 months, we probably could do that. It'd be a little artificial because we don't measure reserves in that way, but if that was a desire, we could probably figure that out. So what I wanted to go through is first just some basic adjustments to the reserves, or what will happen in the next 3 years in reserves without us taking any action at all. So we start at the beginning of each of the fiscal years with the beginning balance of reserves. For example, next year our beginning balance projected would be $27.4 million. And then consistent with our policy, the budgeted surplus that we have actually programmed in the budget, half of it would go to the operating reserves and the other half would go to capital. So this is the half that would go to the operating reserves. And I wanted also to note that we have an adjustment for reduced settlement costs. I think we know our more recent estimate is at a lower number for a case you'll be hearing about shortly. So our adjusted reserves at the end of the year next year would be 28.3, and just the numbers sort of flow throughout the 3-year period. But in the middle section, you'll see some proposals at least a proposal and some adjustments that will occur over the next 3 years to reserves without us taking any action, other than the first item, which is converting a waterfront loan and treating it as being available reserves. And just some background, in general, things that we consider a long-term asset that are not going to be paid to us over for several years, we don't consider that to be available money to spend. When we measure reserves and tell you how much we have in reserves, it's always in terms of what's spendable in the light of the next budget year, for example. We've been treating a $1 million loan to the waterfront as being unavailable, even though we have another loan from them from much earlier that we've been treating as available. So we've been inconsistent. And we think that because the reserve balance is at the waterfront, they have fully funded reserves and reservable policy, that if we had to, in an emergency, call that loan, we could do so. So this would propose to treat that $1 million loan that we have outstanding that will be paid over the next 10 years or so, treating it as being available. So we'll be looking for validation or confirmation from council on that. We think it makes sense. And then we also have some repayments of other loans outstanding over the next 3 years. One is the fact that the general fund lent money to the general plan update process. It was about $2.5 million, and it's being repaid over a 20-year period at $100,000 per year. We treat that all as being unavailable. Over the next 3 years, $300,000 will become available. And then we also have under our Employee Mortgage Loan Assistance Program loans that are due this next 3 years. They will all be fully retired by 2024. But in the next 3 years, we expect to have somewhere around $500,000 or $600,000 paid through the natural principal payments and the fact that some are coming due. So you can see that we're going to have in 2016 $1.2 million of money that will become available, assuming council supports treating the loan from the waterfront or to the waterfront as being available, and another $275 in 2017 and $361 in 2018. So those are things that then affect, I believe, are sort of the scope of our problem, which is shown at the very bottom. In 2016, we have a $1.9 million shortfall, so smaller than the $3 million we were talking about before, so a lot more manageable. And the numbers aren't cumulative over the next 3 years. You can see that it grows a little bit. So if it's essentially a one-time problem. If we were to solve $1.9 million this year, for example, we would have just a few thousand ongoing to address, but we would essentially address it in 1 year. And similarly, if we were to address it in 2017 instead, we would still be looking to one-time solution, not an ongoing structural problem of $1.8 or $1.9 million. Does that make sense? It's really essentially trying to close the gap on a one-time basis whenever you decide to do that. So the options are going to be 1, 2, and 3 years, as I mentioned. And I've not necessarily proposed the solution to the entire problem, but just some ideas. But all of these can be used. We've suggested the use of some one-time money because, as I mentioned, it's primarily a one-time thing. So if you're looking to make cuts in one ongoing, then you're sort of almost overcutting. So under this scenario, what we would be required to do as one option would be to allocate the 100% of the current year, this current year we're in fiscal year 15, with whatever we project to be the surplus, all to the operating reserves, foregoing that 50% to capital. So that would generate $674,000 of additional money going into the operating reserve bucket versus capital. So it would be foregoing capital that we've been using for the last few years to supplement our regular capital program. And then we would also do the same for the next fiscal year. So the projected surplus of $670, or actually a total 1.3, the half that would normally have gone to capital, we would suggest one option is to treat all that as being going into the operating reserve bucket. And then we would still be short $521,000. And so we would have to look to the other options that I've listed there. Reducing the in-service enhancements is one option. They total $750,000. We could reduce the normal capital program. In 16, it's $3.6 million. In 17, it's 1.3, and in 18, it's 1.4. We can also, as some have suggested, just bump up what we call our anticipated year-end variance. That's the amount that we budget each year, and next year it's budgeted at $2 million. We could bump that up if we feel strongly that we're going to generate that additional variance. And then you can see we also have requests from outside organizations, because that would actually not be a solution, but it would actually, to the extent that council wanted to fund some of those requests, it would require some funding from another area to cover that. So you could see that we solved the problem in 2016. Because some of it is a little ongoing, we're going to still need a little bit in 2017 and 18 of ongoing solutions. Really, to me, that's just noise. If we solve it in 1 year, we sort of solve it, because that's such a small percentage. In my opinion, we're essentially there. Any questions on this approach? So closing the gap in 2 years is just spreading some of that over a longer period of time, over 2 years. So this would still, at least I would suggest that we would look at the funding toward capital, shifting that to our operating reserves next year, and then this year's reserves, of course. We'd still be left with a $521,000 shortfall. And again, this is just one approach. We can approach it in different ways. But then next year, we would have to come up with other options of about $735,000 to close the gap by the second year. And you see still the solutions the options that are there at your disposal. And then in 3 years, again, just spreading things out longer term. The first two items are the same, but we would get basically a third of the way there next year, and then another third of the way the following year. Then by 2018, with some ongoing cuts of 450 and 433, we would close the gap by 18. Yeah, go ahead.
So, Madam Mayor, I thought I'd chime in right here and kind of put the big policy perspective of the choices you're going to have to make. And basically, you've got competing priorities that you're going to have to weigh and value and prioritize. And those priorities are replenishing reserves up to the policy level, your funding for capital, the departmental request for restoration of services or enhancements, and then also the fourth option are those requests from outside organizations. In the budget that we presented to you, I felt it was a fairly conservative budget compared to historical budgets, in that we had ballpark figure $2.1 million surplus that we were looking at. And what we did is we went kind of a third approach with regards to restoration of services, replenished surplus, and capital, in the sense that we budgeted about $750,000 of enhancements and then created about a $1.4 million appropriated reserve, which, based on your prior policy, half would go to capital and half would go to reserves. And that is much more aggressive in trying to replenish reserves than any prior year budgets, because the historical approach to replenishing reserves is to do fairly conservative budgeting, and at the end of the fiscal year, either through increased revenues or reduced expenditures, come up with the surplus and roll that into reserves. And that's traditionally how we have budgeted and replenished reserves, and we've been able to do that successfully over the years. And so this is kind of upfronting some of that and being somewhat conservative, especially based upon what departments had requested to kind of do. We kind of tampered those expectations down. Now you add in the outside agency request on top of that, because that's then just an equally competing priority of what you're dealing with. So that's what we presented to you as the staff budget, and then Mr. Samario's kind of laid out these other options to even be a little bit more aggressive towards making a priority of replenishing reserves up to policy. As staff, we have no problem whatsoever having that dialogue and conversation. You know, it's great to get to full policy reserves. It's just this balance of competing priorities that we're having to talk about. And it is interesting to note, if we had not had that council priority of putting half of our end-of-year surplus into capital, we'd be at full policy reserves right now. I think it was a good decision to prioritize infrastructure and capital, but that's just, again, it's one of those competing priorities. And so if we want to defer that policy for a while and emphasize reserves and tamper down some of our capital expenditures, we can do that. And I can give you some idea of where I would probably go if you were going to ask me to reduce some of the departmental requests and other ideas as well, if you want to. So, but that's kind of your big picture, and that's the direction we're looking for tonight to wrap up the budget this cycle.
Okay. So we have a number of public comment speaker slips. And yes, I was just going to say, but if you have any questions before we get into philosophy, that's fine. Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I would like to ask, the conversation we had at Finance on reserves came down to the question of do we replenish reserves in 2 years or 3? And I would like to ask how much money would be available for us now if we went with a 3-year as opposed to a 2-year replenishment of reserves. What quantity of dollars would that give this council to allocate if we by the way, the conversation has always been amongst us was we support filling our policy reserves soon, and then that was it's that small area that we had a difference.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember White, so I guess your question was what would we need to close the gap in 3 years?
How much money would we have to spend now if we intended to hit our target in 3 years instead of 2?
So in terms of actual reserves that we would have in place, if that's your question.
How much money would we have? We're going to hit our reserve policies in 3 years.
Right.
How much money instead of 2? And 2 is what the Finance Committee is bringing forth. But let's say we're sagging that 1 year. How much cash money would we have to spend in this, let's say, 1 or 2 year budget cycle?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure? Okay, that's an answer. I always appreciate somebody saying that they don't know.
I'll take a stab at if I'm understanding your question correctly. Up here you have the 3-year plan, and what the Finance Committee originally struggled with was 1 year versus 3 years. And you settle on 18 months, and our recommendation would be is that you settle on an even year, 1, 2, or 3. It's our recommendation. It kind of works from our budgeting and accounting standpoint. If you look up here, if you want to close the gap in 3 years, what's different from the proposed budget? So I've given you a balanced budget proposal, and so there isn't any extra money to spend. There are priority choices about what you can reflect on. If you wanted to make getting to your policy reserves in 3 years a priority, you need to sacrifice capital funding for a couple years, and that's what this shows. And so basically the difference between 1 year and 3 years is that you don't have to sacrifice other already proposed priorities. You don't have extra money to spend. I don't want you to think that by going with a 3-year plan, you've got an extra $2 million to kind of spend on additional priorities. That's not the case. We provided you a balanced budget, and I would say that's kind of your starting point, the proposed budget. If you want to go to 3 years, you're going to make a shift and say we're not going to fund as much capital for a couple years. And if you want to do it over 1 year, you're not going to fund capital. You're going to reduce some of the new departmental budgets, and you're going to have to make some additional capital cuts and some other things. So it's how much do you want to cut, I think, is more the discussion as opposed to how much do you want to spend.
Well, I don't think capital is the first place to go either. You could say there are other things that you'd rather not spend this year in order to put it into right. So that's
absolutely
the whole variation.
And those are your options. There are a limited number of options. You've got your 4-legged stool that you're talking about: outside entity request, departmental request, capital, and reserves. They're tough choices. That's why it's not easy. We're not teeing up an easy question for you.
And since I had the floor there, I'm using the cups being half empty and half full. I'm trying to find out how much less we would cut. It seems to work better in discussing it with you rather than how much we have to spend. So, trying to find a way to get in there and say there's got to be a difference between 3 years and 2. How much is that, and how does that translate into behavior for this year and next year?
So you would have to cut some amount by the same amount in all those 3 scenarios, just how quickly you get there. So in this scenario, under 3 years, you would not have to cut all that $521,000 that's the remaining. You would be able to say, okay, we haven't got there yet. We left $500,000 still short of the
521 amortized over the next couple of years.
Right.
Might that be a way to look at it?
Yes. You can see then by the next year we cut another $450. This is then another $433 by year 3. But you get to the same dollar amount by then 3 years or 1. It's just how quickly you get there.
And Madam Mayor and Councilmember White, from staff's perspective, again, we're comfortable whichever scenario you want to go because it's all good fiscal prudent planning. And so I'm not arguing
No.
against anything. You know, our feeling about 3 years and the 3-year option and what we had presented is that when you're $521,000 short after year one, we often make that up just based upon the vagaries of managing a $110 million budget. I mean, that's less than a half of 1% that, you know, you need to kind of break in your favor to get there. And so that's why we've tended to be a little more wanting to take the 3-year approach or something like that as opposed to a more dramatic 1-year approach. But again, dramatic 1-year approach, you get there, and then you'll have the vagaries that'll break to your benefit in future years. So,
thank you, Madam Mayor.
Yep, Mr. Hart.
Mr. Casey, you mentioned that you had some suggestions about how you would prioritize the service enhancements if we were looking to make adjustments there. What would that be?
yes, and again, that'll be dependent upon what level you ask me to go back and do. But we met and kind of discussed in, you know, depending upon how far you wanted me to get, I would look at probably one of the suggestions was to move a transportation position out of the streets fund and have the general fund support it, which traditionally it has. And Bob, maybe you can go back to those slides. We could defer that conversation and leave that position funded in the streets fund, and that would break to the benefit of the general fund for about $122,000. I don't like it, but I would probably recommend not funding the fire department public education position that's been on hiatus for 4 or 5 years now, just kind of from a priority standpoint. The other staffing positions I feel are really needed. I think the children's librarian position is really critical. Ms. Schmidt really needs help on labor negotiations now that she's a department head, and the other stuff is fairly pretty minor in nature. I would then probably look at capital projects that are proposed in the $3 million capital projects. The Parks and Recreation Department is the biggest benefit on the capital side, and I'd probably look at scaling back some of those capital projects that we recommend funding. And again, depending upon what number we're looking at, but 1,000 Steps, we had some prior money dedicated towards developing 1,000 Steps, and maybe we would just maintain that and not do the extra $100,000 to get that. Urban Forest Management Plan. You know, it's kind of a policy plan. You could defer that for a year or two. And so I think that would be something we'd have to choose. And again, all these are good projects, which is why we're recommending that you fund them. The dog off-leash park areas, that's kind of a new discussion to do. And our feeling is maybe, you know, if we're really making an emphasis on getting reserves up, maybe we don't take on a new initiative. And so maybe we defer that, and that's $100,000. And then if you're even looking more, then I would use that same logic on artificial turf, which has been kind of a new interest of council to look at artificial turf, and we got $275,000 in for that one. And so you could scale that back. And I think capital is not an unreasonable place to look because replenishing reserves is a one-time issue and capital is one-time funding. And so that's kind of my thought process if you're looking for direction to me about where I would go.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd like to hear from the Financial Committee their reasoning on asking for 2 and 3 years, or we got to 18 months. Could you please talk about that?
Mr. Francisco?
So one of the things that we think is important about this, I mean, we could decide to have a lower reserve level. We could change our policy on that. We could do that anytime. But if we're going to have the policy levels that we have traditionally had, it makes sense, I believe, and I think the rest of the Finance Committee agrees, it makes sense to get there when economic times are good. We don't have other good opportunities, and we haven't had better economic times for a long time than we have the last few years. So it seemed to us that if we were going to close the gap with policy, now is the time to do it. Now, Mr. Hart was advocating that we achieve that in 1 year. Mr. White was advocating 3 years. I proposed a compromise of 18 months, which people went along with. Mr. Samario is unhappy with that because he says, we can't do 6 months. We can only do years. So he's arguing for a compromise of 2 years. But the general idea was that we believe that if we're going to have that policy level, we should get to it, and we should get to it soon because the economy could head the other way anytime.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We're going to have an upcoming discussion in less than a month on vacation rentals, which is the source of some $800,000, I think, in revenues, is it not? And if big if, but if there was a dramatic change on the part of the council and reduce that to zero, let's say, what does that say about all this?
Madam Mayor and Councilmember Hotchkiss, Mr. Hart's brought that up. Councilmember Hart has brought that up as well, that we kind of have that kind of big decision hanging over us to be determined. And I guess my feeling is I don't want to overreact. You haven't made a policy direction yet. If you do, it may take some time to implement it. It could have a substantial impact on the budget, and we'll address that either at mid-year or as part of the next mid-cycle process. So I'm not personally feeling the need to pre-plan from a budgetary standpoint what your future policy direction and the implications of that might be. And quite frankly, over a year, you have an ebb and flow with your revenues from all different sources. You might have a couple auto dealers that come online in the next year that we haven't necessarily budgeted, and there's just swings that happen organically. And I would kind of treat that one as organically, and we'll adjust as appropriate based upon your policy direction.
Right.
It's a decent number that's hanging out there, though, absolutely.
And I didn't mean to forecast anything in one way or the other. I was just trying to figure out where this go. So if I'm hearing right, you like the 3-year option better than the 2. Is that correct?
I'm not going to argue strongly for 3 over 2. I would probably argue more strongly for 3 over 2 over 1, just because I think the vagaries of the ebb and flow, we're going to get there. And I know that's not as comforting to you all, trust us, that's how our budgeting always works. We always end up a little better to the good.
No, you're just being optimistic.
Yeah,
that's all right.
But traditionally we have been. So it's also kind of based on historical fact and practice. And so I kind of like at least having a 2-year process to allow for a couple of those dynamics to occur. But again, if we go for it in 1, we'll go for it in 1 and get to full policy reserves again.
All right,
That's not a bad scenario.
All right. Well, at least we all agree on the goal. Just a matter of how fast we're going to get there. Thank you.
So just one more question before we get to public comment, and that has to do with, I know some of the public is asking for, which is there's a outside organization request for $50,000 for community choice energy feasibility study. And I guess my question is, given that we're about to look at a contract and vote on a desalination plant of 40 whatever or 30 something million, whatever the number is, we'll know when we see it, a big number that is going to take up a lot of energy. To me, there seems there could be a nexus in having the water department pay for that $50,000 as opposed to the general fund. Does that make sense? And I don't know if Mr. Kalan, if there's a way, it seems like that there's a nexus there, and if there is, then that could be a policy decision that we could still fund the $50,000. Sorry, Ms. Bjork, I know you're in the back of the room, but that might kind of alleviate some of the other options. But I just wanted to ask you that up front.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember, I think that's a policy call on the council's part. I think desal, but also just water and wastewater in general, is an energy-intensive facility within our city organization. So I think there's some logic there.
Okay. So that's the first question is whether do you fund it. The second question is that another option of where the source of funds could come from. So, and Mr. Kalan, is there any kind of legal issue that we could get in trouble with using water funds for that feasibility study?
Yes, Madam Mayor, but not in the manner you've described.
Oh, okay. So we could do it in the way, it would be an okay thing to do.
Yes.
Okay.
As long as you make the determinations that it's based on offsetting carbon emissions or however you want to describe it.
Right. Okay. Okay. With that, why don't we get to public comment? And thank you all for your patience, but you can see where we are in terms of making decisions. So there's a lot we want to do, and there's only so much money in the pot, as they say. So I have 2 minutes up at the podium here. We'll start with Joe Tumbler and Jessica Wishan. Did you want to come up together, I guess? Okay. And then Matt Schuster. Good afternoon.
Hello. Honorable Mayor and City Council members, my name is Jessica Wishan, and I am the Managing Director of Casa Esperanza. Thank you for your ongoing support of our work. I want to take a moment to provide context for our request for continued discretionary funding of $125,000 from the city's general fund for fiscal year 15-16. We have made significant progress both financially and programmatically in the past 2 years. We are on track with our merger with PATH to begin July 1st. PATH adds considerable expertise that we would not be able to develop on our own resources. Casa Esperanza will change its name to PATH Santa Barbara. A local advisory board will assure local input into all key operating decisions, and 3 of Casa Esperanza's board members will join the Central Path Board. In the past 6 months, we've deepened the breadth of services we provide. We've formalized an expanded series of workshops for our residents, which support our effort to develop individual services plans for each client. We continue our sobriety-based program serving Santa Barbara residents who have fallen on hard times. A testament to these changes is in our outcomes. In the month of May, 8 individuals graduated our program, and Casa Esperanza found them permanent housing. 20 of our residents have jobs, some of them working 2 jobs. Our shelter beds continue to operate at full capacity, and we continue our good neighbor policy in support of our responsibilities to our community. To sum up, we continue to make significant progress on all fronts, and the merger with PATH will accelerate our ability to do so. Now I'd like to ask Joe Tumbler to describe our financial plans for the next year.
We briefed you previously on the progress that we've made financially over the last 2 years. I'd like to discuss the strategy that we have in place to balance our budgets in the longer term. There are 3 elements to it. The first is to work to obtain higher cost reimbursements for the services that we provide. For next year, our budget already has included cost reimbursements from all of the entities with whom we do business. So we're making progress in a multi-year effort to get our reimbursement levels where they need to be. Second, we continue to look at ways to cut costs. Our spending is about $900,000 below the level that it was 2 years ago. We just cut from the draft budget that you've seen $40,000 out of our expenses by outsourcing our security services. Finally, the third element is to obtain funding from new sources, and this is where PATH plays an instrumental role. We have already applied for a Department of Labor grant for homeless veterans. We've developed a preliminary list of new funding sources, many of which are federal, that we will evaluate for suitability when the funding applications become available. While PATH will add significantly to the credibility of our applications, this process is not a short-term fix, and we expect that these grant awards will materialize over the next several years. To meet our obligations to PATH to be self-funding for this coming year, we respectfully ask for your continuation of the $125,000 one-time discretionary general fund support. We've made a similar request of the county. We thank you very much, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Oh, we do have a question, Mr. Hotchkiss.
I could.
Go ahead.
This $125,000, I wasn't real clear. Is it going to be for operating expenses?
Yes, Madam Mayor and Councilmember Hotchkiss. Yes, it will be for operating expenses. We have almost no capital budget.
So, would we therefore expect this request next year also?
We are now at a cusp. With the merger, there are far more unknowns than we otherwise would be able to predict. And so how quickly PATH is able to generate new sources of revenues for us is unproven. So we clearly expect that PATH will gain traction over the next 12 months and be able to bring in incremental funding that we otherwise would not have access to. The ambiguity is that it's just not obvious how fast that will be. Our hope is to diminish our request for next year and hopefully not have it.
Right, and if you didn't get a balanced budget at that point, it would be a matter of reducing services of some sort, correct?
And that obviously is always an option that we would face and would take the necessary steps to deliver a balanced budget.
Yeah, because as a city, you always think maybe we could ask them a little bit more, but I don't think it could.
I don't know how to respond to that, sir. I apologize.
You don't need to respond to that. It's okay. That's all right. Thank you very much. Okay. Matt Schuster, will be followed by Leslie Wiscombe.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, members of the City Council. Matt Schuster, Executive Director for TV Santa Barbara. I'm here to speak in favor of the staff recommendation for funding levels for TV Santa Barbara for the next fiscal year. A healthy democracy in a local community requires a local communications infrastructure which allows for the whole entire community to participate in the creation, organization, analysis, and transmission of information. The Knight Foundation and the FCC have both backed up this analysis in recent studies. Public and educational access television is equally important to the local cable system and to the local communications infrastructure as government television. And I used to run government television, so I have a sweet spot in my heart for government TV, but the public's ability to share their information and their voices directly is critical to the success of our democracy in our community. A percentage of the franchise fees and DIVCA-PEG fees should be allocated to the public use of this system. Today's media environment only provides an illusion of choice and diversity. There are only 6 major companies which control 90% of all information that we consume through radio, television, and print and online media. In this area alone, there are, out of 4 news operations, there are only truly 2, because 3 of those local news operations on television are combined into one news department. Area organizations still reach out to TV Santa Barbara to assist them in developing media and for exposure for their causes and their services. The need for access to media production resources, training, is still critical, and it is still cost prohibitive for individuals and many nonprofit organizations in the community to access this equipment on their own. And we continue to work towards further diversifying our revenue through facility fees, member fees, donations, corporate sponsorships, and training revenue. But balancing that additional further financial burden on our members and on the community will be prohibitive for them to access the resources and have a vital voice. Thank you.
Leslie Wiscombe will be followed by Howard Green.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and members of City Council. I'm Leslie Wiscombe. I want to commend the Finance Committee for their recommended approach to closing the gap in our policy reserves. But obviously, with more aggressive restoration of reserves to policy levels, some other areas of the proposed budget will be affected. As Mr. Casey had discussed frequently during budget presentations, reserve restoration is one leg of the stool. As chairman of the Parks and Recreation Commission, I'm here to speak on support of 2 other legs of the stool: the department's capital funding needs and restoring services within the department since its budget suffered so severely during the recession. The department manages 46% of all general fund facilities and 47 parks with 22 playgrounds. Their proposed capital program includes projects that address both safety, welfare, within our facilities and infrastructure maintenance backlogs, both high priorities of this council. As well, it includes projects such as the off-leash dog area, which is a very high-demand project in this city. The reinstatement of the project management supervisor position is key to achieving successes within the recommended capital program. With ongoing progress to renovate the Carrillo Bathhouse and Pavilion and other smaller projects, this position is especially important to manage public outreach and expectations and bring our projects in on time and on budget. The recreation specialist position will assist with programming at the Carrillo Recreation Center, and that generates revenues. And this is a revenue stream that we all want to maintain for citywide benefits. The Parks and Recreation Commission strongly supports these proposed additions to staff for FY 2016 budget and strongly supports the department's proposed capital program. We hope that you'll include them in your proposed budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. White, you had a question?
Yes, I did.
Go ahead.
So, Ms. Wiscombe, if you had to prioritize those 2, the project supervisor and the Carrillo Rec Center, which would you fund first?
Personally, we didn't discuss this at the commission level. Personally, because I come from a project management background, I think we are in a time when it's very important to have a project manager. I think, there are things that are going to be changing at the department based on Ms. Rapp's announcement, and Ms. Zachary's had her plate pretty full, and I think she's done an excellent job. But I think it's time to get a capital project management supervisor on staff, definitely.
Thank you. Howard Green, and then Chuck Flax.
Howard Green, Madam Mayor, council members. I thank you for asking the questions as to what the administrator might cut, because that was a very appropriate question, and it was nice to hear the answer. It'd be nice to have a slide on that also, so that you can have that for your consideration. I'd like to point out that the shortfall is only about 2% of the model or goal for reserve. So a very aggressive move to reduce it I don't think is necessary. There's a lot of infrastructure problems. And I think that cutting back on the capital is a poor choice. So I would suggest stretching it out to 3 years. The outside organizations, and the one that I'm most familiar with, which is community television, are important partly because they get funded through a franchise fee that the Cox Television collects based on federal legislation, which helps to pay for the P and PEG, public education and government. Sorry, the G part, which you guys are. So you all have a forum, and we should have a forum. And so I'd like you to keep it going. Thank you.
Chuck Flax will be followed by Tom Woodrow.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of the City Council. I'm Chuck Flax. I'm the new Executive Director of C3H, the Central Coast Collaborative on Homelessness. And I want to thank you for your funding of our organization and to have you think about it in terms of as an investment in management of our services across the board to end homelessness. We have essentially two missions. We want to end homelessness and we want to reduce the impacts of homelessness on our community. I'm here to support the two initiatives that address homelessness directly, Casa Esperanza and Common Ground. Casa Esperanza spoke very eloquently, and I think you hear their argument. Common Ground is an interesting story because they have essentially served as our foot soldiers in the, and maybe that's the wrong analogy, to really work closely with the homeless population on the street, meeting with them, learning their names, learning their stories individually, helping them get the services that each person needs, and ultimately getting them housed. From our perspective, Common Ground's work has been substantial in the success of the Milpas Street project, which I think many of you have heard about directly. The hope with this additional funding is to replicate the success that we've had on Milpas on State Street, and to really see if doing this kind of triage effect of working with the people who have, unfortunately, the biggest impact on our public resources, getting them housed as quickly as possible will have a net impact that's much greater than the small amount of money that they're asking for. So from our perspective, this small grant request is really an investment in a new approach to tackling homelessness very specifically and personally, and reducing the public impact. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tom Woodrow will be followed by Hillary Blackerby.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of City Council. I only wish our friends in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento would labor over the expenditure of each dollar the way that our City Council does. We wouldn't be $17 trillion in debt if that were the case. So thank you. I just wanted to say there are some places that you can save money. And with all due respect to our friends at Government TV, my wife and I and our kids haven't had cable TV in 10 years, so I don't really know what goes on Government TV, but the democracy is still basically working for us. In an age of YouTube, Vimeo, Facebook, etc., I'm not sure that we have those $400,000 a year to spend. If you look at the potential proposal that we might be going to the voters for infrastructure repair, $400,000 a year over 20 years adds up to $8 million. That's a full year of that proposal. So that's real money. Not that we don't want council meetings and budget meetings televised, we do, but other than that. With regard to human services, there's $700,000 there that we give to some very good organizations, but at the same time I would warn or hazard to say that it's a luxury to be able to put out that money to those organizations when we have yet to fulfill the prime directive of public safety and infrastructure. It seems to be the prime directive of what local government's about. Finally, I would recommend with regard to, if you look at our agreement with Marburg and the Solid Waste Division, I believe Marburg can and should perform community outreach. That's something I think we do as a city now, and I think the whole purpose of outsourcing that is to save money. It might be as much as $350,000, and we should put that on the shoulders of the contractor to go ahead and tell, really advise people about that. I know they'll want to earn the contract again from you folks. And the final thing I would say with regard to the airport, $20,000, not a lot of money, but I carry a cell phone around. If you had a permanent billboard up there that advertised our best websites that tell about what goes on in Santa Barbara, I think people would take their cell phones and go to those websites. Thank you very much.
Madam Mayor?
Don't you know billboards are controversial issues? I'm just teasing you.
I didn't mean billboard, but just something on the wall.
I'm just teasing you. Did you have a question for Mr.
No,
Woodrow?
I didn't. I just wanted to let Mr. Woodrow know that PEG stands for Public Education Government. Government TV is what is being broadcast right now. Mr. Schuster is from TVSB, which is Public Access TV. And I forwarded you an email. They're having an event, and, as a former public access TV producer myself, I would invite you to go find out what public access TV is about. They have a wonderful facility. They have youth programs. It's all about people having their own voice. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of information.
I appreciate that.
City Watch
Thank you.
could be on Channel 17. You
could have your own show.
It could happen.
I actually would like to retract that statement about the 400,000. Thank you.
I'm just saying, it just could happen. Hillary Blackerby will be followed by Dave Hopkins.
Good afternoon, Mayor and City Council members. Hillary Blackerby here on behalf of Assemblymember Das Williams. I know you have a lot before you, but want to urge you to allocate $50,000 for the feasibility study for community choice energy. The time is now. It's really important. Don't really care if it comes from general fund or water, wherever you get it. Be sure to get it. Talking about spending a little now to save a lot in the future. Cities that are already under community choice energy, like San Rafael up in Northern California, they've got about 59,000 residents, and they've saved 107,000 just in city energy costs alone in 1 year. So just know that you spend that, if you end up going down the road and entering into CCE type situation, you're going to end up saving money in the long run. So good luck with your deliberations, and thanks for your time.
Thank you. Dave Hopkins, be followed by Tracy Beard. And then we're going to have Mike Weissman, Jefferson Linton, and the final speaker would be Emily Allen.
Good afternoon, Mayor and council members. And my name is Dave Hopkins, and I'm a peer navigator for Common Ground Santa Barbara, a volunteer for the rescue mission, certified drug and alcohol counselor from SBCC, and was homeless in Santa Barbara for a decade, and the homeless representative on the South Coast Homeless Advisory Committee that ended a couple years ago. And with my past experience on the streets and currently doing outreach almost every day presently, and so saying this, I've seen what works and what doesn't. And right now, Common Ground has been working in the solution, and that is going out and meeting our street friends where they're at. We've been in the solution, housing some of these individuals, working with them, getting them acclimated back into society. This has been going on now with the Milpas Project, which is now being done with some of the business owners on State Street, meeting our friends where they're at in the solution. We have already began helping some of our friends that are homeless with different races, sex, ethnic backgrounds, addictions, and mental health issues. It doesn't matter their situations. We're talking about the human beings with problems in life and that they need some guidance getting back on their feet and off the streets. And, it's the, I just see I don't know anything about finances and all that, but robbing Peter to pay Paul. I just see that where the police department's not going to have to be used as much on writing tickets, going to different things that are happening on the streets. And we are working with some of the most chronically homeless, and they are seeing the glimmer of hope. And all these volunteers that come with Common Ground. And, this is such a project that other people are just keep saying, my God, keep doing what you're doing. But, I love this work, and it's
Thank you.
gratifying.
Thank you for doing
and
it.
It's paying to see, when you see somebody's eyes that have been out there for 20 years, and they ask you, that it's a Spanish gentleman I've been working with, and he turned around, and this interpreter told him he's trying to get you housed, and he just turned at me with tears welted up in his eyes and gave me a hug, and there was no words to be said. And it's not just Common Ground that would appreciate this. I think it's all those people that are trying to get off the streets. Thank you.
Tracy Beard.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and our City Council members. I come to you as a new board member for TV Santa Barbara. TV Santa Barbara is one of our last public operated broadcasting for local voices. Historically, public broadcasting is one of the last forms of our community voice. Please do not cut funding when you're thinking about our budgets. Do not cut our voices. We do need to have our voices here at TV Santa Barbara on funding. I know your hearts are deep when cutting for nonprofit organizations. Those funds would kill our budget very much so. Your community support is very valuable. It provides a voice. Your investment to the community is for over 790,000 productions of resources last year. I know many of you use that public voice, and we need that public voice. And we also need you, and we need your support. So thank you.
Thank you. Just to clarify, there's no proposal to cut funding. There was a proposal to increase funding. Is that correct? By about $19,000?
That's correct. The request was for additional funding beyond the 3%. That
Okay, so the current budget is status quo funding. We're not cutting. That's not a request. Right. Okay. Right. I just wanted to be clear about that. Okay, Mike Weissman.
Madam Chairman, council members, my name is Mike Weissman. I'm a 17-year resident of Santa Barbara. I originally was a scientist, engineer, but having started a company in Santa Barbara that's doing fairly well now in Goleta, I consider myself an entrepreneur and a businessman. For about a year and a half, I've been working as a volunteer for the World Business Academy. This is a group that's been around for quite a while as a think tank with the mission of helping businesses become more socially conscious. In the past year and a half, they've now become an activist community group because of the need that we all see for safe, reliable, renewable, 100% renewable energy. And the way to get that starts with our local community. This is not a political issue. It's not a business issue. It's not a residence issue. It's an issue that is important for the whole community. To demonstrate this, we co-sponsored a forum at the Faulkner a couple weeks ago that brought in representatives of the business community and the environmental community at the same table, all agreeing that we need to have community choice energy within Santa Barbara. Community choice energy gives us the means to create our own microgrid within the community so that we can provide sustainable, 100% renewable energy to our people. We've also been distributing a petition that's gathered 1,000 supporters.
Thank you.
So please fund the feasibility study, which starts the process going. Thank you.
Jefferson Litton.
Madam Mayor and fellow council members, my name is Jefferson Litton, the Energy Program Manager at the Community Environmental Council. Yesterday, hundreds in our community, including 4 council members here, gathered just steps away in De La Guerra Plaza and stood in unity and in hope for cleaner energy. It's appropriate that just one day later, the council is considering funding for community choice energy, which is the most important action that we can collectively take towards this clean energy future. However, community choice energy is more than just clean energy and greenhouse gas reductions. Existing community choice programs have demonstrated that community choice offers cheaper rates than the existing utility, local control, local economic benefit, local renewable generation, and job creation. I urge the city to at very least allocate $50,000 towards the feasibility study and encourage the city to allocate even more. As you know, Santa Barbara County is currently considering a feasibility evaluation and seeking out partners in this study. Last Tuesday, Carpinteria City Council passed a motion saying that they support being a part of this feasibility and sharing costs. As I mentioned to you on May 18th, the Community Environmental Council is committed to raising $50,000 towards this feasibility study. An allocation from the city would show that we stand together in taking this hugely important step towards community choice. I would also like to remind Council that any startup fees, costs incurred could be reimbursed upon program launch, and that this program would be ratepayer and not taxpayer funded. The tragic oil spill on the Gaviota Coast reinforces the urgency of providing energy alternatives. Community choice energy provides this alternative, as well as ratepayer savings, local economic benefit, and job creation. I urge the Council to allocate funding towards this widely beneficial program. Thank you.
And Emily Allen will be the final speaker.
Good afternoon, Mayor Schneider and council members. My name is Emily Allen, and I supervise the Common Ground Santa Barbara County Homeless Volunteer Project. The project started in 2011 after our first countywide vulnerability survey, when hundreds of volunteers got up early in the morning to go out and survey people experiencing homelessness. This survey and those that followed provided us with invaluable data that not only helped us better understand homelessness in our community, but also to identify the most vulnerable people, those most at risk of dying outside without intervention. In 2012, we hired a volunteer coordinator to train and coordinate volunteers to do street outreach and housing support. These volunteers work alongside professionals. In 2014, we started working with C3H and the MCA to identify both the most vulnerable and those that were having the most impact in the Milpas area. Some of these impacts include expensive calls for service. What we sought to do was to work with the business community to identify housing, supportive services, and when appropriate, reunify people with family. We did this by adding a paid team leader and a peer navigator. The program was successful, and at the end of year one, we decided to continue. In 2015, we began working with the downtown organization and others to create a similar project in the downtown area. And we, at the Finance Committee, the downtown organization, the MCA, and the Chamber of Commerce all supported this request for funding. This has really served as a model, not just for the city, but potentially for the entire county. And just today, the mayor of Houston announced that Houston had effectively ended veteran homelessness, showing that this really is an issue for cities to take on. We are also asking for donations from the county, individuals, and foundations, but your support would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that concludes the public comment, so it's back to the council. Do we have we usually have the Excel sheet that we go back and forth. Did we do that? I meant to ask you earlier, and I have a feeling you know.
We didn't, Madam Mayor. We thought about it, but we thought maybe if you could just provide us some broad direction with some preferences of how you might want to approach this in terms of closing the reserve gaps. We can come back to you. In fact, we would be able to, if necessary, come back on the 16th with our recommendations based on what direction you provided to us, with your sort of being able to review it, ratify it, and then we would adopt on the 23rd or the 30th if necessary.
Okay, so come back on the 16th
Right.
to do that. Okay, so I guess what I'm hearing is there are at least 3 members of the Finance Committee, I would say myself also, so there's 4 right there, about figuring out how to close the budget, the reserve gap. The question is how fast. And then and because that was not part of the original draft budget. So that's a change in policy itself. And so there was there were scenarios in 1 year, 2 year, and 3 year. So I guess whether it goes 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, it sort of depends on what else, if anything, we actually want to fund that is not in the budget, or what would we want to cut that is in the budget. So I'm not sure if we want to say 1 year, 2 year, 3 year right up front. We may want to say, well, what are the things that we want to either cut or add, and then see where we are and see if we can meet that funding gap in 1, 2, or 3 years based on what's left over, and if then we can massage that. But I think if we have a fight over 2 or 1 or 3 years without then going into, well, what exactly we're going to do to make those numbers work, I'm not sure we'll circle back to get to where we need to. So I'm trying to figure out how to massage this to make it work. So that was just a first idea here. Mr. Hart, your light's on. Why don't you want to start talking?
Well, I think that makes perfect sense to me. I think it would be helpful just to start the conversation. I hope you have that chart that we had at the Finance Committee that showed reserve levels over the past 20, 25 years, something like that. That was really powerful, I thought. I think all of us at the Finance Committee thought that really framed the issue. You don't have that?
No, we don't have it handy.
Okay. Well, maybe I see Mr. Casey looking around, seeing if that could be generated. But it is great to see a consensus developing that we're going to try and close the reserve policy sooner than later. I think last year when we were doing the budget, we looked at this issue and were pretty confident that we were going to be able to do it this year. But we've had a couple of extraordinary legal settlements that really set that back. Those were very large one-time legal settlements. But I think that does point to how volatile this is and how difficult it is to actually get to the finish line, even though we're really, really close. And so to me, I feel very strongly that we should close that gap. And really it's just a matter of when we would do these additional things that we're talking about. We could do them this year, and we could defer the reserve policy attainment goal for a number of years, or we could achieve the reserve policy now and then just defer those things for another year or two, maybe even another just 6 months. As Mr. Casey mentioned, when we do the mid-year budget adjustments, it's quite possible that revenues will be coming in ahead of where we are. So there's a lot of different ways to get from here to there. I think that Mr. Casey's suggestion that there are some staff priorities that we could look at, the $122,000 streets capital transfer to the general fund, the fire outreach coordinator, the combination of those two things is $214,000. Delaying some of these capital projects an additional year, I'm not sure that we're actually going to be able to get to them all as it stands, given the realities of how complicated some of these projects are. I think the combination of those two things is in that $700,000 range. I think that's sufficient by itself right there, just doing those two things to get us to that reserve policy requirement. And I think it's really important in the long term when we're talking about additional revenue enhancements and going to the voters and talking and making a case about how we do need additional revenues to meet our capital needs, to be able to say fundamentally we are fully funded with our reserves. That is sort of the starting place to me to making a fiscal case to the voters that we have our house in order. And if we had that chart that showed how reserves dipped, during strong economic times, got exacerbated dramatically during the recession, and have been climbing their way back out, the story is that we need to fully fund our reserves and protect our reserves during good economic times. And here we are, coming out of a recession, recovering, making progress in that goal. But we have to be cognizant of the business cycle. I think that's the big lesson from the last recession, is that good times do not perpetually sustain themselves. And that we need to be in a position strong with fully funded reserves for that moment in time. I agree with Mr. Casey that looking ahead to the potential reduction from vacation rentals isn't necessary at this moment in time, but it also has to color this conversation because it is an element looking forward and betting on the curve that the economic good times will sustain themselves over a 3-year period, betting that we are not going to see a reduction in transient occupancy taxes as a result of a decision about vacation rentals is sort of trying to deal to an inside straight, and I think we have to be careful with that. So my personal view, I thought that the discussion at the Finance Committee was really productive. I appreciate Councilmember Francisco's, half the loaf approach. is a great way to go. In addition to that, I think that the service enhancements that are being proposed from staff are important, but they're not critical on an annual basis, this year basis. We have deferred some of these things, and there are differences within that list, too, in terms of the criticality. So I personally think that we could do triage on that list. That's another $750,000. And I think that the request from the community organizations is equally valid within that conversation. Those were not part of the budget deliberations because they came in after that. But I think that that many of them are extremely important and very valid and really leverage money, particularly the Casa Esperanza request, the PATH request, the Community Environmental Council's request for community choice energy. Frankly, a lot of these things are very relatively small dollar but big leverage items in terms of community benefit. And you can see where I came down on the Finance Committee. But I think these positions are consistent. I think you can get there with all of these. It's just a matter of timing. It's a matter of when you try to achieve these goals. So for me, I would start with getting the reserve policy met within this year. I would look more critically at the staff enhancements, and I would be supportive of the community organization requests in large part. And I think doing that, looking at increasing revenues over a 6-month period, we may very well be able to come back in 6 months and look at some of the service enhancements that we had to defer today and make those as a mid-year budget adjustment in the future and still achieve all these goals.
Okay, but before I get to Mr. Francisco, I'm just to clarify, Mr. Hart, all the outside community requests, they're very different from each other. They're different numbers. So I'm taking what you said in finance, you're sticking with in terms
of... more or
your...
less. I mean, obviously, those are not fixed in stone. It's
right.
Subject to our discussion. But I don't think there's probably a $200,000 to a $250,000 spread. I mean, a $50,000 spread between, I think, things that have a lot of support and things that have less support. So.
Okay. Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Let me say first that the goal of all of this, the reason that we're here and city government, is to fulfill the basics first and everything else comes after that. In Santa Barbara, we're used to being able to do a lot of the other stuff, but we find ourselves in a situation where public safety, the requirements for public safety, the basic requirements for infrastructure are hard to meet. It's an unusual situation. It's shocking, really, in some ways, that we should find ourselves in that situation in California, but that is where we are. And so when I look at these, and when we looked at the, for instance, the outside requests at the Finance Committee, part of the way I look at this is, have we fulfilled our basic responsibilities? We're talking about potentially going to the voters and asking for an additional half-cent sales tax to do what most people would regard as an absolutely basic responsibility of a city, which is to maintain our streets. So in my mind, if we are going to do that, and the only way that I would support that was if we were serious about focusing the money that we do have in the areas that really count. Now, when we looked at the outside requests at Finance, I was supportive of very few of those, mostly for that reason. I am supportive of the Casa Esperanza request on a one-time basis. And the way I look at that is we have a very long history with Casa Esperanza. And in the last couple of years, I believe that the way Casa is being run has improved markedly. And the experience of the people in the community, both the neighbors, business neighbors and residential neighbors, has improved enormously. So I don't think that this is the time to cut that off. I think they're actually doing what we wanted them to do, and that's great. And for similar reasons, I'm supportive of the Common Ground request. I want to talk about a couple of others of these. The TV Santa Barbara one is important to me. I absolutely do not support any increase whatsoever, and in fact, I think we should be working on reducing that funding. The last time I asked staff about this, because I remember very clearly a discussion we had a few years ago, it was in 2010, and we cut their budget. I can't remember what it was, $120,000 or something that year. And we said, look, you have the equipment, you have the studio, you have an opportunity to be generating outside revenue, and you're going to have to do it. You have to become self-supporting. If someone were to come to us today and say, I have this wonderful idea. We want to establish a brand new TV channel staffed by volunteers from the community, and it's only going to cost the general fund $325,000 a year. I think we would say, absolutely no way. There are many, many options for members of the public to get their viewpoint out there. Matt Drudge has one crummy-looking website, and he probably has a greater influence than anybody else in this country on what people are thinking about the news and opinion. We do not need to fund a separate TV channel to provide that kind of opportunity for people who want to get their views and their opinions out. It is essentially, and this is not, the people who are doing this, they are wonderful people, and there's an educational aspect to this. It's all good. But is it something that the city needs to be supporting with taxpayer dollars? I would just say no. It doesn't. It does not make any sense. So I certainly don't support increasing the budget. I support getting it down to zero, not immediately, but within a period of, say, 2 to 3 years. That should be our goal. I wanted to bring up another thing that was, and this is not a general fund issue, but I brought this up when we were talking about the solid waste fund, and I followed up on this. I checked with Marburg, and we have, I can't remember, Mr. Samario, is it 4 or 5 positions within the solid waste fund that are outreach positions?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Francisco, we have 2 people who are doing outreach currently. 2 recycling educators.
Okay. I thought it was 4 or 5. But anyway, whatever the number is, that work is work that Marburg does in other jurisdictions, and there's no reason Marburg can't do that work here as well. And if there's anything that I'm misunderstanding about that, I'd like to know. But I think anything that we can do, obviously that doesn't affect the general fund, but it affects the ratepayers who are paying to have their trash picked up. So if there's work that we're doing in solid waste that can be transferred to Marburg, I want to do it. And finally, another area in which the city is spending money, in which I don't think we really have the resources to spend it, is human services. Traditionally, human services has been a county responsibility. And I agree, given our extraordinary problem in this city with homelessness, we have to put money into that. But we should not be putting in money at the level we are. It's public health, welfare, those areas have traditionally been county responsibilities. And I don't think, I look at the money that's coming into the county to support those services, and I don't always see the output. And I don't think the county even sees the output. So there's some dysfunction there, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But we need to get away from spending money in an area that is not traditionally part of city government. It's county government. And make sure the county's doing their job. And as I said, we'll probably continue to have to spend some money in that area, but I want to cut back. I don't think that we should be spending $700,000, $800,000 a year on an area that is not within our responsibility. And if we had incredible revenue and money was no object and our reserves were where they were, then we could talk about doing things like that. But I would rather talk about reducing the burden on the taxpayers. Thank you.
Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And while I did support bringing the reserves proposal forward at the 1.5 years, I obviously have been advocating the 3-year in the context of this is my 6th year on council, and the previous 5, the performance that we have, that this city has undertaken to restore reserves, starting at 10% of policy, and we've gotten it up to wherever we are, 90 or whatever. So, yeah, well, I came along and basically at the bottom there, and this.
If you like, I can explain this chart.
Why not?
A complicated chart, but it does start back in 1996, and it goes through the projected next 3 years. So it includes 1 year beyond the 2-year financial plan, 2018. I started in 1996 because that was the year just after the council adopted its reserve policies. It adopted it in 1995. And so we began tracking them into the various buckets, and the various colors represent the different buckets that we have or have had. Starting at the bottom, the green portion represents the disaster reserves. That's 15% of the operating budget. So it moves in tandem with the size of the budget. And then above that in the brown, I guess, color is we call their contingency reserves. That's 10% of the operating budget. The little yellow portion is what we used to have in a capital reserve. It was a fixed dollar amount of $1 million that we kind of did away with and blended into the contingency reserve starting in 2013. To the far left, you'll see the bar where there's the pink portion. That represents reserves that we had in excess of our policy requirements. So you could see, for example, in 2003, we had somewhere around $8 or so million above policy requirements. And back in those days, we were much more, if you will, we were more conservative with the revenue estimates and projections, and so we were generating a fair amount of reserves, and we were funding our capital from those reserves, along with other one-time costs. We don't do that anymore. We fund our capital through operating revenues because our reserves have sort of shrunk. But you could see, as Mr. White and others have indicated, during 2005 or the period of 2005 through 2008, our actual reserves went down, and there were some good reasons, some reasons that, for example, that was the time when we implemented our MLAP program. We lent out about $4.5 million of our available reserves, converted to unavailable reserves that we're now seeing being repaid. The other half was just essentially a cost exceeding our revenues. And we have been able to restore that and reduce that gap. In large measure, we were helped by the fact that our budget was not growing. In fact, it was shrinking, so the reserve requirements were slightly going down while we were generating these surpluses during some tough times. In 2014, we're about a $2 million gap. It's going to project to be a $3.3 million in 2015, or 16, excuse me. But again, we're talking about now the adjustments that we've made with the MLAP repayments, the GPU repayments, and then the conversion of a waterfront loan. We're projecting that gap to be closer to about $2 million. In over a 3-year period, when you're talking about the surpluses, unanticipated surplus, that's really a small amount to gain over a 3-year period because we might be able to get there organically. Can't guarantee it. But so these projections at 4.3 were before we kind of made those proposals to reflect the MLAP repayments and the waterfront loan and so forth. But that's how that sort of shakes out.
Well, thank you, Mr. Samario. But I would also say it shakes out because of the intent of the council, and that the number of us have been there since that bottom point and have constantly harped on the issue of returning to policy reserves. And so I think there was certainly at that point when we were in the worst of times, we could just as well said, well, let's spend some more of our reserves because these are terrible times. And we did not do that. The belt was tightened, and I think Mr. Armstrong certainly guided us well with how to do that with the least pain and to keep as many services going. And that then, of course, time's gotten better, and we have been prudent about that. And I think that's where I hope that's where we will continue to go. And my argument is that, by goodness, we can get there in 3 years, and it would free up some extra cash for things now. So that's with that in mind. Then I'll get back to the specifics of what I would support. I appreciate the mayor's comment about the community choice. I think that belongs in the water fund, and that would relieve the general fund ask here. I would change my position on the legal aid. I think that is a public safety investment. It's one that we've seen an extraordinary collaboration between the business community. Milpas has led the way, I think, with a wonderful effort, and now the downtown organization is following on, and I think it's worth this council's while to continue supporting those collaborations. Extraordinary. And let's see, are there others that I would change at that point? I think that the rest I would stay the same. That is to say, Casa Esperanza I do support, and the reduction in rent for PAL, small number. Okay, and then I feel it's a little bit I think it's something where we can, if we're going to meet back on the 16th with staff, there's a definite triage in this list of staff changes. I can picture what I've witnessed with the finance from the outside is that system has run on overload for a long period of time, and so that's one place where it just seems anyway. And I know that you folks would come back with that sort of priority list there of what's the gotta haves and what are the nice to haves on that list. And of course, I asked Ms. Wiscombe a question that's one of the uncomfortable ones, and I appreciate that she didn't back away from it, but put a bona fide recommendation forward. So, but I do think that there's a priority list amongst that staff list, and it's a substantial amount of money, so that we can get part of the way there, and then some of those add-ons would be deferred until the reserves are fully funded, and of course, with the hope and expectation that our finances are continuing to improve over these next couple of years. What else here? I think that's about it. I think we're close and amazingly close again with the ability to pull this together into a cohesive package. I appreciate Mr. Francisco's comments about public services coming. We're offering a 0.75% of our general fund budget goes towards some 55 NGOs, nonprofits here, and I just see that. I mean, even for example, I remember and I appreciate that. I think that I brought that forward when the city put $25,000 towards the Spirit of the Ocean fountain reconstruction, an important project for our tourist industry, and it also gave that foundation the ability to go out and fundraise and say, we have support from the city of Santa Barbara. And that's an important ingredient that those 55 nonprofits get. They can say when they're on their PR and fundraising efforts, they can say, we got a $5,000 grant, we got a $25,000. It isn't a lot of money, but it's real support. So that's the side of it that I think has been useful, and I also think it needs to be certainly no more than what we're investing in that effort. But I think that is a good investment. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Okay, Ms. Murillo.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So weren't we coming back Wednesday, June 3rd? It's on my calendar. Nope.
I think we can. Go ahead.
Madam Mayor and council members, we have that date, June 3rd and actually June 8th available if we wanted to continue this discussion. If we can't wrap it up today. So it's up to the council.
I think we can wrap up today, but you're going to come because you're going to need to go back and do some prioritization. You can't do that by Wednesday. Our proposal will
come back on June 16th, a Tuesday, and give you sort of our sense of what we heard from you and how we would get there.
Okay, you're sure?
Yeah.
Yes, but Madam Mayor, I would hope that perhaps you can give. I mean, at some point you got to make decisions.
I'm taking notes.
Exactly.
I'm taking
like
notes.
The outside organizations, that's kind of a key decision point, and then kind of a general direction, and we can kind of come back with the details that kind of fleshes that out and present that to you.
Okay. What I'm hearing, just to be clear, so I'm hearing comments from my colleagues. I'm taking notes on where there's at least 4, if not more, to go in a particular direction with any particular item. And then the idea is for you to figure out with this overall picture of how to meet the reserve gap, in a particular time. You're going to come back and see what things on the 16th we would actually have to cut in order to get to to that ultimate goal. So I think for today, we want to figure out where you are individually on all these different items and prioritization so they can do that work. There's no way you can do that by Wednesday, I don't think. So, yeah. So go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I do support the community choice energy funding, whether it's from the water fund or otherwise. I did just want to say a couple of things about public access TV, that it's not taxpayer dollars. It's money that comes from Cox Communications because they have a franchise and they've taken over the people's airwaves. And so it's what they pay for that privilege. That's what it is. Yes, that is. And I just recently got some really bad customer service from Cox Communications. So I'm going to tell the world to contact me if you want to talk to me about changing service or changing anything or walking through their doors. I have issues, and I'd like to talk to you, Mr. Samari, about the service that Cox gives and the way they raise their rates. And the public access TV station is that little nugget. It's a gift back to the public for taking over the airwaves. I support all of the items, Madam Mayor, that are related to homelessness. We have an excellent record here at the city of a law enforcement response, but also services. And I support Casa Esperanza and the Common Ground projects. I do need to look at that list. Mr. Casey, you said something about not going forward with off-leash dogs, and you know what? If we're talking about these issues, and you also mentioned the urban forest, and I would really need to look at that list and digest it and talk to people and find out what my constituents are thinking too. These are pretty big discussions that we're having. I support closing the reserve gap. I think Councilmember Hart is correct that if we're going out for a sales tax initiative, that we need to show the public that we have a plan to put our piggy bank back together. And so I like the compromise of 2 years, if that's what it turns out to be. But I know we're doing it the other way. I absolutely do not support sending Marburg any of our, giving them any more work related to their franchise contract. Mr. Four was here and gave us this spirited, and he's so together. Environmental services is so well respected. They do such a good job. I'd also like to tell the employees out there that, no, you're doing a good job, and I don't want to give your jobs to Marburg. Mr. Four made a really good argument about having in-house control. So I'm going to look over more of the points, Madam Mayor. Thank you.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'll just go down the list from the Finance Committee. Regarding Casa Esperanza, I've said before, and I'll say again, that I want to reward good behavior and the turnaround these people have done. But I do think that it should be not ongoing, but one time, not established. But we should review this as there's been a history pattern that's lately been very, very good, but been troubled over time. Regarding the community choice aggregation, I think that's a creative idea on your part, Madam Mayor. I'm also still trying to noodle what really is what is the feasibility study. This is a number that could be 50, could be 100, could be 1.5. I've heard a lot of different things, so I'm going to need to hear a lot more about how that really works and what it really brings us. And I really want to get to actually Mr. Dewey one-on-one and ask him what he really thinks about this, but probably not in public. Santa Barbara Chamber, regarding the Airport Visitor Information Center, I do think, and I do support their presence out there. I do think that whatever we can do, especially as we talk about trying to enhance revenues, whether it's within the airport, whether it's making people feel comfortable, welcome when they come in, whatever we can do to make those amenities more viable. This is not a very big amount of money, so I'd be supporting that. Status quo funding for summer solstice. I know in their letter they mentioned other community festivals and whatnot, but we also, kind of gave them a building, so I think we've done pretty well by summer solstice. The after-school sports program, I do support that enhancement. I do support the PAL reduction in rent. I think that's a doable thing. The Legal Aid Foundation, I think, is a very interesting project. I think they've done fabulous work on Milpas, and I know I've listened to them as Common Grounds come in and talked to us at the DO Safety Committee. I do, however, want to point out that in Santa Barbara, the city, if you add up things like what we're doing right now, CSOs, blue shirts, yellow shirts, our restorative police, our money going to CASA, our C3H money, we're pretty close to $1 million in what we do right now in just those things. So I don't think we're not doing our part of the work. I really think the county could step up and kind of explain where, what was it, $10.5 million, whatever Health and Human Services is and where that goes to. And then I had a question on Spirit of 76 in a letter from Mr. Lamberton. It talked about the $5,000 as if they were expected to be reimbursed. Is that correct, Mr. Samario?
Yeah, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse, that's correct. The first item is we gave them $5,000 this past year, and apparently it cost $10,000, and Spirit of 76 apparently contributed that additional $5,000, so they're seeking a reimbursement from us for what they paid out of pocket.
All right, very good. Thank you. And then TV Santa Barbara, I do think that, and Mr. Francisco makes a good point, we have talked about in the past whatever opportunities there could be to raise revenue, to be a little bit more self-sustaining. The ongoing support is fine. I don't see the need or the logic behind the increase at this point in time. So that's where I stand on those.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'll be quick here. I'm okay with Casa Esperanza. I agree they've done a great job, and they know that we're going to be looking at them carefully ongoing basis, but they should be rewarded and complimented for the changes they've made. The aggregation thing, I think, is probably a can of worms, and it's not money I would like to spend now. People do actually have a choice of power and how they get their power for solar, if nothing else. The Chamber Airport Visitor Information Center, that's okay. Summer solstice, I don't know if we can give them all that, but we'll see. PAL, for sure. High school, after-school sports, that seems to be a good idea. Legal Aid Foundation, no. Spirit of 76, they're asking for so little, I think we would be foolish not to give them. And TV Santa Barbara, I don't think we need to increase that.
Mr. Francisco?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd like to understand something about this community choice energy request. Are they requesting that we pledge $50,000 to a study, or are they requesting $50,000 to CEC?
Yeah, they are requesting $50,000 toward our, city's contribution toward a larger study. The estimate is sort of, as somebody indicated, is still a little vague, but the latest, what I heard, it was in the $350,000 range, so they'll be looking to have the CEC fund part of it, but I think it would be a county-led effort to do a feasibility study to see how we can implement it here in the South Coast.
Well, if it's a county-led effort, why would we be giving money to CEC?
They're the lead agency in putting the study together, that's why.
It would involve multiple agencies all coming together to form sort of a joint powers authority that would then be the
That's not the study.
No, but it would just be the feasibility portion of that.
I think the way I interpret it, CEC is an advocate for community choice energy, and they're going around to government energy, agencies and trying to get support and interest and expression. And so they submitted a letter asking us to step up and take a leadership role and put $50,000 towards a study. Since the letter came in, the county had a hearing on it and expressed interest in maybe leading the effort. I got a letter from the CEO of the county, and going to have a meeting with her and her staff next week to kind of talk about logistics. And so I see this as the city putting $50,000 towards community choice energy to be determined how we partner and do this study going forward. And we'd bring that back to council before we did anything with that. So I see this more as a policy commitment on your end, towards community choice energy with $50,000 towards a study that will figure out whether we're in the lead, whether the county's in the lead, and how that goes. I don't see this as giving CEC $50,000 to then go do something. And I think that they would agree with that.
I'm seeing nods in the back of the room by CEC. So, okay.
So the way I look at this is what we're talking about with this is establishing a joint powers authority. And it will be a joint powers authority from the little I've read about the Marin arrangement. It'll be a JPA with a level of complexity at least as great as COME, greater, I would assume. This is a huge undertaking we're talking about, and I just find it bizarre that we're getting a request from an outside organization, oh, could you kick in $50,000 to this however many multi-million-dollar project this might or might not be. This is not the way that I'm used to having these kinds of requests handled by this council. What I would expect is that we would get a staff report saying, these are the benefits that this JPA would offer to the city. And this is the way that we think this should be approached, and we think we're going to need partners in blah, 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 blah. And either we say we need a commitment from council that you would commit funding X if the other people participated, which I think is probably the realistic way to approach this. But I just find it bizarre. We don't have a staff report. We don't have any backup information other than enthusiasm from the CEC, which has been true since I've been on council. There needs to be a little more documentation before we commit to spending $50,000, I think.
Well, I think you said it. I think that what's being asked is to set aside in the budget $50,000 towards a study, and that the details of which are coming back. And then if we say yes to those details, we have the money in the budget to put it in. And I think that's what Mr. Casey was saying in terms of figuring out what those details are, who's in the lead, who's doing the study, what the study entails. And we don't, and who knows what the study will say, and the study might say it's not feasible and so we're done, or it might say these are your options, and then the council at that point, whenever that happens, can figure out do you want to continue on with it or not.
So the way you're saying it is that we would be committing to spend up to $50,000 on a study if we later agree that the circumstances for that study are good. There's enough other people who've said they're going to contribute, and
there's nothing for us to vote on today on spending $50,000, right? That's going to have to be a council decision, policy decision on entering into a contract, and we could that's a decision that council makes at that time.
I would agree with that.
Okay.
What you're doing is you're setting aside, you're budgeting the money for $50,000, but for us to expend it, we're going to have to bring back to you a recommendation and a plan about what this
and a
study's
staff
gonna
report.
study.
And
Let me give an example. Last year, when we were talking about what's now the community service officers,
Yes.
the proposal was very different than what we have today, but we set aside the money that we used when we finally figured out the details of what we wanted.
That's fine. And
So
if
it's a
it's
similar situation, I would say.
From looking at the chart, it looks like we're going to cut a check to CEC.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. That's fine. All right.
Okay. So, go ahead.
The other thing, Mr. Samario, how much of the funding that goes to TV Santa Barbara, some of that is the PEG money, but some of it's general fund money.
Madam Mayor,
How much
Councilmember-
in each?
Yeah, so there are two pots of money that funnel through the city that goes to TV Santa Barbara. One is operating money that comes out of our budget. That's the community promotions budget that's currently in the mayor's office. I think it's about $300,000. And then there's a portion that's restricted to capital. That's the additional 1% that we've added on to the bills for cable subscribers. Half of that goes to our own city TV operations for capital, and the other half goes to TV Santa Barbara for capital as well. And that portion is about $140,000 for each.
Okay. So that the $140,000 to each, that's money that ratepayers are paying. That's part of their
That's
bill.
correct.
That's tacked onto their bill.
That's correct.
But the bulk of the money that goes to TV Santa Barbara from the city is general fund money.
It is general fund money, and it's long history with that. My understanding is that once upon a time there was this sort of connection between franchise fees we were collecting from Cox Communications and the amount that we were then transferring over for public access. But my understanding is that a number of years ago that was sort of delinked, and so there wasn't any connection between franchise fees And what we pay public access, that's a discretionary decision on the council's part, out of general fund resources.
Okay, just wanted to be clear about that. And then what I would like is an evaluation. Is there? It looks to me from this org chart that there are more specialists in solid waste than two, but in any case, I would like to know, is there anything that they are doing that is specific to some city goal that's different from other cities that justifies having that in-house rather than having Marburg do it? Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. So for me, and then we'll go back to Ms. Murillo, but just so I can get some feedback here, I think I'm going to give you my top priorities. I know with staffing, you're going to come back with some prioritizations, but I'll just put a plug in there that the library position, since we're opening a children's library, we need a children's librarian. That makes sense. And the changes in administrative services, because that's with Christy moving over to the department head, makes a lot of sense. Same with the attorney's office. I mean, those, and then I think in the police department, the council, we had that discussion a number of times, and it just makes a lot of sense to, hopefully with the dispatch, to have a civilian in that position. So and just in terms of my top priorities of all that just my feedback as you come back. I think as we're balancing closing the reserve gap and the timing of it, I agree with the philosophy. If we're going to the voters and getting our fiscal house in order, if we want to ask them for more money, I also think there's also an argument of making sure we're putting in as much towards general fund capital without going to the voters is also important. So I wouldn't want to cut that too much. I think the 3-point-something million in your capital budget is a good number, and don't want to cut that too much. If there's specific projects that we may not even get to this next year, that could be deferred a year. That can help us with one-time savings in the capital piece. That makes sense to me, but I wouldn't want to decimate I don't want to go. That to me is not a zero-sum game up here of saying just put all the half of the surplus from capital into reserves, because that was part of our discussion going out to the community saying this is what we're doing about infrastructure. So just as we have a small gap now in our reserves, we have a very big gap in our infrastructure financing, capital need in the general fund. So having a plan, as was saying, that we are moving forward with a plan to meet our reserve gap and significantly increase the amount of general fund money we're putting into capital ourselves. So we're not asking the voters, if we put this on the ballot, to pay for everything, but to pay a part of it because there is such a big gap. I think, it's like you said, it's a four-legged stool, it's a balancing act. So just some feedback there as you're looking at those topics. I do think there's probably one or two items in next year's capital budget that could be deferred a year just based on workload that would help meet that gap. And then in terms of the outside funding sources, community choice energy, I'm supportive of, and if it can go into the water fund, then that can help alleviate the general fund budget situation. Certainly, I think the Casa Esperanza, and I know you're asking for ongoing, it does make sense to make it one time just because you're in flux with PATH, and we'll know a lot more, you'll know a lot more what's going on in a year, and we'll see how that goes from there. And then, we're hearing great results from the Milpas project, and if anything, if the one thing I'm hearing about homelessness in Santa Barbara, it's about State Street. So if we can spend $25,000 to positively impact the effects on homelessness in the downtown core, and we have an example of what's going on Milpas Street and try to replicate that on State Street, that just makes all the sense in the world. So I think, so I see a majority of people up here for that funding as well. And then really I could go either way on these other requests. I mean, I know there's small dollar amounts. One question I had about PAL, which is, they're asking for a reduction in rent. Is that going to be, so we give them a reduction, or are all the other organizations that rent from city facilities now going to say we want the same thing? I mean, what makes PAL, is there something that is, is Independent Living Resource Center going to come to us next week saying, hey, why not us, or Work Inc., or what is it about? Is there something special about this particular request?
Madam Mayor and council members, we actually had that discussion as staff before we put this recommendation forward. I think the biggest difference is that PAL is providing services that previously the general fund was responsible for. And that really for us became the demarcation line.
Okay, then I'm fine with that. That as long as there was some differentiation, then that makes sense. So those would be my priorities.
Madam Mayor?
See how that works. Yes, Mr.
Having
Casey.
listened to all 7 of you express your priorities, and we have that up here, my calculations of it were that the 4 boxes that were highlighted had majority support from 4 or more council members, with the Casa Esperanza being one-time in nature and have them report back, and that the water fund pick up the community choice energy cost. In addition, the Legal Aid Foundation, the Common Ground request, also had a majority vote. So that would be a 5th box that I would put up there. But that's what I heard from council as we kind of went through. And
that sounds right to me. Okay, Ms. Maria, you had your light on.
Yes, thank you. You heard me or read my mind, Mr. Casey, on that. I did want to say that I would vote for Solstice and for TV Santa Barbara on this list. And then I just wanted to advocate for the Children's Librarian and the Zoning Information Report outreach, just, on that other list. But I know we're going to talk about that. When I first got elected, I asked Mr. Dewey, he's sitting in the back, for information about community choice aggregation, they were calling it then. So we do have some in-house reports, and staff has studied it and done some work on it already. So I did my homework. And then I'd like to ask Mr. Samario if you could let me know the franchise fees that Cox pays. The telecommunications giants were able to delink that, but that doesn't mean that what that money was meant for originally. And what they did in the city of Oxnard, when the city of Oxnard was able not to support their public access TV station, they just closed it. So, and thank goodness we're not doing that here in Santa Barbara. I'll be looking forward to that information from you, Mr. Samario. Thank you.
Okay, so Mr. Casey, at this point, do you think you have enough direction? What else do you need from us?
I would probably just like a little more direction on how many years you want us to kind of bring back a plan for, because that does make a difference as to whether it's
a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 3. I
think there's support for 2 years.
There's definitely. I think there's support for 2 years if we can fit all this in. I think that's the question, right? I'm seeing. Yeah, Mr. Rouse.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, I'd like to kind of reiterate what you said, though. I'd like to look at the 3-year scenario as well, because if we are to go out to the community and say we're going to put the half-cent sales tax on the ballot to do infrastructure, well, we should at least show that we are doing stuff on our own end without having to go to an extra tax revenue.
So here's my suggestion, that you come back with 2, but show an option for 3 with the difference in the numbers being pure capital, because that's what it sounds like the difference is, right?
Yep. We can do that.
Okay. Mr. White?
Just in support of that, in this particular little window of time, costs, we're not seeing costs going up so fast in capital projects, and so that bit of money is available to get more. We can get more bounce out of that bit of money now for a capital project, which in a few years inflation may come back and is likely to come back and would make that money less valuable. So we have a chance to get a little more bounce for that chunk of money that a 3-year reserve program would make available for capital purposes.
Okay. Does that do it for you? Okay. So I think we have enough direction. So we don't need a meeting on Wednesday, and we don't need a meeting the following Monday.
Correct.
What shall we do with all that time? I don't know.
Exactly. So we'll bring this back on the regular council meeting on the 16th.
On the 16th.
For kind of your final direction, and then we'll put the budget together and bring it back either the 23rd or 30th for adoption.
Okay. Thank you all for your patience and for your comments very much. Appreciate it. We are adjourned.